March 2007. The salty moisture from the Pacific clung to the basalt rocks at the base of Diamond Head, creating an atmosphere heavy with anticipation, as if a truth buried for nearly 6 decades was finally about to surface. The beam from Investigator Keoni Masuda's flashlight cut through the darkness in a narrow rock crevice, illuminating something no one had believed was still there after generations. Central, I need backup at the Diamond Head ledge and send the forensics team immediately. His voice echoed, bouncing off the cold, dry rock walls as if awakening memories from 1950. What began as a routine cold case file review had now become something entirely different, something that could finally answer the questions that had haunted Honolulu for 57 years. Human bones were discovered deep inside a basalt crevice, and nearby lay fragments of rotted gray-brown fabric, identical to the material once found in the old Hale family storage shed, fabric tied to the night Marion Hale vanished in 1950. For more than half a century, Marion's disappearance had been nothing but an endless chain of unanswered questions. A vibrant young woman beloved by her community stepped down the seaside stone stairs after dinner and melted into the night. 2 children grew up with empty chairs at every holiday table, a bedroom door their father never closed. Before we continue this shocking story, please take a second to hit subscribe and like the video. Your support helps us bring forgotten cases back into the light, and the algorithm will make sure you never miss the next episode. Because the discovery at Diamond Head wasn't just the end of a missing person case. It was the first domino that would topple decades of buried secrets in a small Hawaiian coastal community. When authorities finally identified a suspect and made an arrest in 2007, it wasn't a stranger or a nameless drifter. It was someone the community knew, someone they trusted, someone who had lived among them for nearly 60 years, carrying an unimaginable secret. The Marion Hale case isn't just a solved mystery. It's proof of the persistence of investigators who refused to let files gather dust, the power of modern forensic science giving voice to victims silenced for too long, and the story of a community torn apart. In 1950, suspicion spread through the Honolulu neighborhood like an oil slick. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Families stayed silent for fear of saying the wrong thing. The search for Marion exposed cracks lying deep beneath the calm surface of the post-war years, cracks that would finally split wide open when the truth emerged after 57 years. What makes this case especially haunting is that the answer had always been so close. The prime suspect had been interviewed during the original investigation, but slipped through the net. For decades afterward, that person attended memorials for Marion, stood beside her children, looked them straight in the face, while carrying a secret no one ever suspected. Where are you watching this video from? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always curious how far these stories travel and how they connect us across vast distances. Tonight, we're going back to 1950, tracing the disappearance that shook Honolulu, and uncovering the stunning breakthrough that brought one of Hawaii's oldest cold cases to its day of reckoning. This is a story of loss, silence, deception, and ultimately justice delayed, but never denied. Hawaii in 1950 still carried the rhythm of a place in transition, a traditional agricultural economy blending with the first sprouts of tourism, while the heavy U.S. military presence after World War II created a feeling that was both safe and foreign. Coastal Honolulu back then was a small, slow, gentle city where red dirt roads wound along the hillsides and the smell of salt air mixed with drifting plumeria blossoms. In the neighborhood at the foot of Diamond Head, low wooden houses nestled against the ocean, their wide eaves opening to deep blue skies. At night, faint oil lamp light spilled from windows, and a basalt staircase carved into the cliff led straight down to the water's edge, a spot where locals often went to catch the evening breeze. In a small house near the end of the row, Marion Hale lived with her husband Leonard and their 2 children. Marion was a young nurse, known throughout the area for her dedication and the quick, energetic way she moved between the clinic and home. That evening began like any other, a quiet dinner, the kids in bed early, the ocean still lapping steadily against the rocks outside. But as the night wore on, Marion told Leonard she felt stuffy and needed some air. She slipped on a light jacket, stepped out onto the porch, and walked down the stone stairs toward the sea. A habit that was completely ordinary for anyone who lived there. The dim glow from a neighbor's oil lamp lit the path, and one nearby resident, still awake, saw Marion walking calmly down the steps, no hurry, no sign of distress. Leonard stayed inside. At first he didn't notice the time passing, but as the clock ticked past the usual late-night markers, 1 o'clock, then 2, the wait stretched too long. He stepped out onto the porch, peering down toward the water, hoping to see Marion climbing back up the steps, but there was only the sound of waves and darkness. Near dawn, real worry set in. He woke the 2 older children, and the 3 of them grabbed flashlights and searched the beach below. They walked the water's edge, turning over rocks, calling Marion's name, but there was no answer. That night the tide had pulled out farther than usual, yet there were no fresh footprints in the sand, no sign Marion had ever stood there. Nothing but the wind whistling through the rocks. As the gray light of early morning spread across the water, the family's tension reached a breaking point. Leonard stood staring at the cold black sea a moment longer, gripping the wooden railing as if it might reveal something in the dark. When the silence became unbearable, he hurried inside, picked up the telephone, and reported to the Honolulu Police Department that his wife had vanished. On the other end of the line, the duty officer took the emergency call and immediately radioed the nearest patrol unit. Less than 15 minutes later, the red and blue lights of the first police car swept along the dirt road leading down to the Diamond Head neighborhood. Dawn light was still pale, the sun not yet up, leaving the scene washed in the gray-blue of a night just ended. An officer stepped out, spoke briefly with Leonard, then asked him to lead the way down the stone path Marion had taken just hours earlier. The narrow cliffside trail was damp with dew. The basalt stairs appeared dark and moss-covered as always. As they reached the top of the staircase, police began documenting conditions, wind steady from the northeast. Not strong. Waves gentle below, no unusual swells. Visibility better than in full darkness, but still limited in shadowed areas. These details were recorded carefully because they would determine whether an accident was even possible that night. One officer knelt beside the steps to check for slip marks, shining his flashlight close to the moss. No fresh scuff marks, no debris, nothing suggesting a fall. They descended step by step, slow and methodical, so as not to disturb any potential evidence. When they reached the narrow strip of sand at the bottom, the ocean was becoming visible in the dim light, but the area was absolutely empty. Police swept the sand near the waterline. No new shoe prints from the night, no drag marks, no bare footprints leading away from the stairs. Only old, blurred prints left by residents the previous afternoon. An officer ran his light along the line where sand met rock, looking for anything dropped or fallen. Nothing unusual. They checked the water's edge itself. No disturbed seaweed, no algae washed up, no interruption in the receding tide line that would suggest a body had entered the water. The officer in charge cordoned off the area. Stakes from the top of the stairs to the end of the narrow beach, then yellow tape to preserve the scene. Another team noted where Leonard and the children had searched earlier, comparing their paths to ensure nothing was missed. Meanwhile, police interviewed the neighbor who had seen Marion the night before, the last person to see her alive. He described his vantage point, the faint oil lamp glow, and Marion walking calmly down the steps. Officers reconstructed his line of sight, marking the exact spot and visible range in low light. Though it offered no new clues, it confirmed the last stretch of path Marion was known to have taken. As the sun rose higher, officers conducted a second sweep. The stairs, the ledge, the sand, the trails leading back toward the houses. No physical evidence, no signs of a struggle, no indication Marion had ever started back up. Everything lay in inexplicable silence. A technician measured slopes and photographed every section, details that might later serve as critical reference points. On paper, that morning's scene was simple. Stone stairs, narrow beach, calm water's edge, not a single anomaly. But that very emptiness made the atmosphere heavier. No obvious evidence appeared as one might expect in a coastal disappearance. No fresh footprints leading out or back. No impression of a heavy object falling or being dragged away. Everything was unnaturally clean. When the initial patrol finished, they gathered near the stairs to plan next steps, keep the area secured, and wait for the official investigative team. Leonard stood just outside the tape, staring down at the misty beach where Marion should have left some trace. But the scene remained eerily blank. As morning light spread across the cliff, both police and family understood this was not a disappearance that would be solved with a few hours of searching. The total absence of evidence made the next steps urgent. Once the area was secured, officers shifted focus to the morning's most critical task, reconstructing the exact timeline of Marion leaving the house. They took Leonard to a quieter spot away from the stairs so he could recount the previous night in detail. Leonard stood by the wooden railing looking out at the sea, voice still tense, trying to recall every minute. He said, "Dinner had been normal. The kids went to bed earlier than usual because of the heat, and Marion seemed a little tired but alert. The moment he remembered clearest was when she said she needed air because the house felt stuffy. According to him, she left around nearly midnight, though he couldn't be exact because he only glanced at the clock. An officer asked him to describe the very last time he saw her, how she picked up her jacket, her footsteps, her voice, any unusual sign. Leonard repeated that she walked out calmly, no rush, no agitation. But when asked if she said where she was going, he replied she only said out for a bit, without specifying direction, prompting the officer to ask several times to confirm those were her exact last words. After recording Leonard's full statement, police moved on to the neighbor, the last person to see Marion alive. They pressed him on the exact time he saw her heading down the stairs. He recalled still hearing strong waves, meaning the night wind hadn't shifted yet, and his oil lamp was still burning. Since his habit was to extinguish the lamp before midnight to save oil, police estimated he saw her sometime before 11:30 p.m. That immediately created a small discrepancy with Leonard's estimate of nearly midnight. Though minor, the time difference was carefully noted because even a gap of minutes could affect judgments about Marion's movements after leaving the house. When asked which way she went, the neighbor was certain she headed straight down the stone stairs, not turning onto the side trail or the grassy western area. Yet Leonard told police Marion often walked in different directions depending on her mood, sometimes to the beach, sometimes along the back trail. The inconsistency between Leonard's description of her habits and what the neighbor actually witnessed complicated efforts to establish her initial path. One officer asked if Marion only wanted a bit of air, would she have gone far from the stairs or just walked around the house? Leonard couldn't answer clearly, repeating only that she hadn't said her plans. Police then checked whether Marion often went out late at night. Leonard insisted no, she rarely did, especially with the kids asleep. The neighbor, however, said he had seen her standing on the stairs on hot nights to watch the ocean. The two conflicting accounts were flagged for later comparison. Officers then spread out a map of the area, marking every possible route. The stone stairs confirmed by the witness the western trail to Lower Rocks. The winding back path rarely used at night, plus several spots she might have reached if she changed direction right after the stairs. The cluster of coconut trees near the cliff edge, the flat rocks where kids sometimes played, and the wider open area toward Diamond Head with heavy brush cover. Each route was numbered with notes on likelihood based on statements, weather, and nighttime visibility. They cross-referenced the two main timelines again. If the neighbor was correct, Marion reached the stairs before 11:30. If Leonard was correct, she left the house near midnight. The gap wasn't large enough to prove anything, but it made reconstructing the exact moment of disappearance harder. One officer asked Leonard why he hadn't started looking sooner if she was gone so long. Leonard said he assumed she'd only stepped out briefly and would return. That was recorded as a factor in the last moment he knew his wife was still nearby. By the time the morning interviews ended, police had compiled everything onto the map. The last confirmed sighting, the neighbor's observation time, and when Leonard realized something was wrong. Though no glaring red flags had appeared yet, the slight mismatch between when Marion left the house and when the neighbors saw her, combined with differing descriptions of her walking habits, had already turned establishing the final timeline of her presence into a far more complex task than expected. The first morning closed with police finalizing their preliminary timeline and movement sketch, an incomplete draft, but the foundation for everything that would follow in unraveling Marion Hale's disappearance. Right after completing the preliminary determination of the timeline and the possible routes Marion might have taken, the police decided to organize an immediate nighttime search to make the most of the remaining time before the tide changed, and to prevent any traces, if they existed, from being washed away or obliterated. As soon as the sun had fully set and the Hawaiian night sky turned a deep purple blue, the patrol teams carrying flashlights, kerosene lanterns, and temporary lighting equipment began splitting into groups and heading down to the beach below the stone stairs. Lighting conditions at that moment were particularly difficult. There were no streetlights in the residential area near Diamond Head. The moonlight was obscured by a thin layer of clouds, causing everything from the rock surfaces to the sandy beach to appear only as patches of black mixed with pale gray. One group walked along the water's edge, slowly sweeping their flashlights close to the retreating waves to look for footprints, pieces of fabric, personal items, or anything else that might suggest Marion had stood there. But the sand's faint reflection of light revealed only the rippled patterns left by the outgoing tide, with no unusual marks interrupting them. Whenever they shone their lights farther out, the beams only caught the glittering surface of the water before vanishing, leaving a completely impenetrable darkness beyond. Another group moved along the eastern rock ledge, where the rough basalt surfaces formed small crevices that often retained seaweed or algae if disturbed. They examined the rock faces closely with their lights, searching for fresh water streaks, skid marks, or broken fragments, but found only the familiar moss patterns, dried sea salt, and natural traces from previous days. There was no disruption in the rock's natural texture, making it increasingly difficult for the police to imagine Marion having fallen, slipped, or collided in that area. A third group headed westward, following the narrow trail that led into the low bushes. The path was only wide enough for one person, with hard ground mixed with small rocks. On that type of surface, if Marion had walked there that night, at least one depressed footprint or disturbed soil mark should have been visible. Yet under the pale yellow glow of the kerosene lanterns, the ground appeared smooth and undisturbed, with nothing out of the ordinary. One officer tested the depth of a few softer patches with a marking stick, but found only naturally compacted soil and no evidence of recent human passage. As the search teams moved farther from the stone stairs area, they expanded the search to include the small clusters of coconut palms and the flat rocky areas where local children sometimes played during the day. These were relatively open spaces, so if Marion had stood there even briefly, her silhouette in the moonlight or the sound of her footsteps might have been noticed by someone. But that night was completely silent, except for the wind rustling through the leaves and the steady rhythm of the waves. They shone lights under every bush and checked every crevice in the rocks, but found nothing except old coconut husks and familiar beach pebbles. The police also swept the dirt road behind Marion's house, a route rarely used at night. Their lantern light only illuminated a small area immediately in front of them, requiring them to sweep the beams back and forth multiple times. The hard, level ground made footprints easy to miss, but after nearly 3 passes, they still found no fresh marks corresponding to the time of Marion's disappearance. The 2 lead officers paused where the road split into 2 smaller branches, carefully examining each one before continuing farther to ensure nothing was overlooked. Yet even after widening the search radius, they discovered no traces or items that could indicate which direction Marion had gone. One officer returned to the beach to coordinate with another group, checking the lower rocks right at the water's edge. They aimed flashlights into the rock crevices, but saw only dark seaweed, fine sand accumulated in the hollows, and rock surfaces with no fresh cracks. The police paid special attention to the possibility that Marion might have slipped and fallen, but if that had happened, physical signs such as handprints or dislodged rock fragments should have been present. However, there were no such signs. The search continued for many hours with the entire team's patience. They repeatedly swept the area in a grid pattern to ensure no gaps were missed. Nevertheless, the effectiveness of nighttime lighting was severely limited. Every step had to be taken with extreme caution because of the sharp rocks and shadows concealing many critical spots. All these factors meant the search served only to confirm the absence of clear traces rather than yielding any further conclusions. As the hours approached dawn, the officers regrouped at the stone stairs. In their quick debrief, they recorded that throughout the entire night, despite sweeping the beach, rock ledges, and internal paths, they had found no signs left by Marion. No shoes, no fabric, no footprints, no disturbance in the natural structure of the rock ledge. Everything was virtually intact, as if no one had passed through that night. This forced the search team to conclude the nighttime sweep with the only possible finding: there was no direct evidence showing where Marion had gone after leaving the stone stairs, and her disappearance still left no tangible clue behind. When the nighttime search ended without yielding any promising signs, the police decided to deploy additional reinforced teams early the next morning to take advantage of better lighting conditions and conduct a larger-scale sweep. As the sun rose above the horizon and pale golden light flooded the beach below Diamond Head, a fresh group of officers dispatched from Honolulu headquarters arrived, bringing additional marking tools, grid search maps, and more specialized scene documentation equipment. They assembled at the stone stairs area, where the night patrol briefed them on all the routes already checked and the locations that could not be thoroughly examined due to limited light. The search commander deployed a grid formation, a method commonly used in missing person cases in natural environments, with multiple small teams moving parallel to each other at regular intervals to ensure no patch of ground or sand was missed. They started at the water's edge and gradually moved inland, systematically covering each section of the beach. With clear daylight, the officers could easily observe the unobstructed sand surface. Yet, despite the improved conditions, the results were identical to the night before. No fresh footprints, no cuts into the sand surface, no depressions indicating someone had stood or sat down. Line after line of officers advanced slowly, the sunlight reflecting off the sea creating blinding glare that forced them to shade their eyes while examining the water's edge. But all their efforts revealed nothing beyond the rippled patterns left by the receding tide. After completing the strip of sand directly below the stone stairs, the teams moved to the basalt ledges on both the east and west sides. In strong daylight, the rock surface's colors were much clearer, making it easier to distinguish old wear from any new skid marks. But after inspecting every step, every edge, every small crevice where waves might splash, they still found no skid marks, breaks, broken rock fragments, or fresh scratches. Nothing was out of place or unusual. One officer even used a handheld magnifying glass to closely examine crevices that might trap fabric fibers or light objects in case of impact. But each crevice contained only old moss or wind-blown sand. Meanwhile, another group was assigned to sweep the paths previously mapped as possible routes. Marion might have taken the narrow western trail, the dirt road behind the house, and the open area in front of the flat rocks. With morning light, they could more clearly check for compressed soil, unusual footprints, or any disturbance of the low vegetation. However, along the entire route, there were no signs that Marion had entered there during the early morning hours. The ground remained flat and hard as the day before, with no discernible changes. The low bushes were checked more thoroughly. They parted every branch, examined beneath the bases, and looked for any broken or freshly disturbed twigs, but everything remained intact. At the same time, investigators tried contacting additional neighboring households to ask if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. But all statements were the same. No one had been outside at that time, No one heard cries, loud noises, or any other unusual sounds. Some residents even emphasized that the sea had been calm and the wind steady that night, making it harder to miss any significant noise if it had occurred. This led the police to clearly note in their report that no new witnesses could add information about Marian's movements or final location. Another unit was sent along the water's edge to extend the search farther to the right side of the beach, where the terrain featured low rocks and a few small sand pockets nestled between basalt blocks. These spots could potentially retain light objects if the tide shifted, but when the team swept through using both flashlights and direct sunlight, they found no items belonging to Marian or signs of objects washed ashore. No fabric scraps, no shoes, no personal belongings. Even the seaweed and algae clung to the rocks in their natural patterns, with no unusual breaks or tears. This complete absence of traces forced the police to extend the grid formation upward past the stairs to the area where the rock platform met the small trails. Once again, it was only dry ground, undisturbed rock surfaces, and old footprints from residents in previous days. After more than an hour of searching at the higher level, the team leader confirmed no new discoveries. As the sun climbed higher and strong light illuminated every corner of the scene, the search team conducted another full sweep to ensure shadows from the cliff had not caused misjudgments. But even after re-examining every square meter, they reached the same conclusion as the night before. No signs of fallen objects, no skid marks, no handprints or grip marks on the rocks. All surfaces were consistent with their natural state, with no sudden impacts from the previous night. When the entire force regrouped above the stone stairs, the morning's collective report revealed the absolute emptiness of any tangible signs related to Marian. No fresh footprints, no physical evidence, no witnesses, no impact marks. The early morning search, despite the support of daylight and an orderly grid formation, still yielded no leads, leaving Marian Hale's disappearance shrouded in an inexplicably thick silence. Immediately after the early morning search ended without producing any clear signs, the search commander decided to expand the area once more toward the southeast section of the rocky shore, where the terrain was more complex, featuring many rock hollows and rough basalt steps, often pounded hard by waves on rough sea days. This area had not been prioritized in the initial sweeps because that morning's unusually low tide had exposed far more of the rock surface, creating favorable conditions for detailed inspection. A team of 3 officers was assigned to proceed down to that section, following the flat rock edge, before moving to the deeper lower areas near the base of Diamond Head. They used probing sticks and flashlights to examine the dark crevices, still holding pockets of water. When one officer knelt to check a flat rock section between 2 raised ridges, his flashlight beam reflected off a small pale-colored piece of fabric pressed tightly against the rock edge. At first, he thought it was just moss or a dried piece of seaweed, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was a thin cloth scarf, damp and mixed with sand. Its position immediately drew the team's attention. It lay on a rock surface at least 1 meter above that morning's low tide mark, which would be completely illogical if it had been washed up by waves. Another officer carefully lifted the edge of the scarf with wooden tongs to avoid distortion, noting that the sand clinging to it was even and drier than the sand at the water's edge, indicating it had been there long enough for the sand to dry naturally. They marked the spot with a wooden stake and recorded it in the field notebook using the rudimentary 1950s method, describing the location by relative distance from the stone stairs, height above that morning's tide line, and identifying features of the surrounding rock surface. While checking wider on both sides, one of the officers discovered a small round metal object beside a crevice to the right, a stainless steel kitchen bowl. The bowl lay on its side with the opening facing down against the rock, containing no pooled water despite the area's high humidity overnight. This suggested it had not been tossed up by waves or recently exposed to seawater. Another officer scanned the rock area above, where there was a gentle slope, and found an additional small glass object lying close to the edge of a crevice, an empty medicine bottle. The bottle was neither cracked nor chipped, which would be unusual if it had been battered by seawater or rocks. The search team immediately reported these discoveries to the Central Command Post for further instructions. While waiting, they continued documenting each piece of evidence in the manner available to police at that time, measuring relative distances with a short tape measure, estimating height above the water by comparing to moisture marks on the rocks, and describing each item's identifying features in handwritten notebook entries. Each piece of evidence was cordoned off with small wooden stakes to prevent movement during wider marking. When the team leader arrived to inspect, he ordered a full sweep of the surrounding terrain in a wider radius to determine if additional items or supporting traces might indicate how these objects arrived. However, beyond the three items, the scarf, the bowl, and the medicine bottle, nothing else belonging to Marion was found. What concerned the investigators most at that moment was not the items themselves, but their placement. That morning's tide had receded deeply, clearly revealing the high water mark still visible on the rocks. When comparing the height of each item to the receded tide line, the search team realized all three objects were positioned in places completely illogical for waves to have carried them. All lay on rock surfaces at least 2 to 3 steps above the high water mark, and moreover, they were not aligned in any logical drift pattern, but scattered, each in a different orientation. The scarf pressed flat against the rock, the bowl neatly inverted, the medicine bottle lying on its side near the edge, but showing no signs of having been spun by water. This assessment led the officers to rule out the possibility that the items had drifted there overnight. If they had been carried by waves, at least one should have been caught in lower crevices, broken, abraded by water, or lying in the intertidal zone. But all three were completely dry on the inside and showed no fresh salt crust, proving no recent direct contact with seawater. Furthermore, the sand on the scarf was fine and dry, not the typical wet intertidal sand, and the bowl had no salt residue or seafoam traces like objects that had been in the wave zone. One officer suggested checking possible trajectories that might have caused the items to roll or fall from above, but the terrain where they lay made that implausible. The rock surface above sloped in the opposite direction, meaning anything falling from higher up would slide down into lower crevices and could not remain intact at the higher positions where they were found. Having confirmed the items could not have moved to their current locations naturally, the search team began analyzing the timeline context. If the objects had been placed there before the tide receded, they should have been fully soaked, or at least partially submerged. Yet both the bowl and medicine bottle were clean and dry inside. This reinforced the conclusion that they were placed there at a time when the sea could not reach them, that is, many hours after Marion disappeared or before the search teams arrived. One officer continued examining the moss layer around the bowl's position. The moss was slightly depressed beneath the bowl's base, forming a faint ring. This indicated the bowl had rested there for a short but sufficient time to cause the indentation, unlike an object thrown hard or dropped from above. For the medicine bottle, there were no skid marks, drag lines, or swirl patterns. It lay too neatly to have been casually tossed. The scarf was even less likely to have been blown by wind, as it was wedged into a concave crevice where wind would have little effect. Once all these observations were fully recorded, the team's preliminary report concluded clearly: the three pieces of evidence could not have reached their current positions through waves, wind, or any natural force. They must have been placed or dropped there by human action after the time Marion disappeared. This discovery meant that the entire team that morning faced an undeniable fact: the first physical evidence linked to Marion Hale did not appear in an area where water currents could have carried it, and the blatant inconsistency with the tide made these items the first anomalies to finally break the absolute silence that had enveloped the scene since the previous night. Right after completing the documentation of the three anomalous pieces of evidence, lying in positions inconsistent with the tide, the search team commander ordered the technical team to return to the stone staircase area to conduct a systematic analysis to determine whether Marion could have had an accident on this very familiar path down to the sea. Examining the staircase was considered mandatory because it was the last route on which a witness had seen Marion, and if there had been any possibility of a slip and fall, traces would normally appear here. Under the clear daylight that had now risen, the officers began at the highest point of the staircase, right next to the footpath leading to Marion's house. The basalt stone surface in this area naturally had a rough texture, but due to salt spray and night mist, a thin layer of moss also made some steps slippery on damp days. Therefore, the technical team used their hands and specialized tools to test the friction of each step, both to assess the risk of slipping and to look for signs that someone had lost balance. But every step showed only the familiar characteristics: thin, even moss coverage, no areas where moss had been displaced, no patches that had peeled off or fresh scrape marks. The kinds of signs that typically appear if someone slips hard and scrapes the surface. They moved down to the next step and repeated the process, checking the moss, feeling the stone surface, looking for any fresh chips or fragments. Nothing unusual. When they reached the middle section of the staircase, where the surface was wider and had less moss because of frequent foot traffic, the technical team paid special attention to the protruding stone edges and old wear marks. If Marion had slipped, at least one of these edges should show fresh impact, a small chip, a graze, or even just a scuff from skin or fabric. Yet every surface was consistent with the natural condition of seaside rock worn down over many years. There were no new fractures, and no spot where the moss had been smeared in the direction of an impact force. The technical team continued shining lights along the small crevices on both sides of the staircase where light objects or pieces of fabric could get caught if there had been a collision. But like the steps themselves, the crevices contained no recent traces beyond natural fine sand and a bit of wind-blown dust. The experienced members of the search team all confirmed that if an adult slipped and fell on stone like this, the likelihood of leaving some kind of mark, even a very small one, was almost certain, because the sliding motion would generate enough force to break the extremely thin structure of the moss or cause slight stone displacement. Yet everything was unusually intact. At the section of the staircase closest to the sand, where seawater regularly splashed when the tide rose, the technical team examined it carefully because this was the slipperiest spot and also the place where a fall was most likely. They used a gauge to measure the slope of the stone surface, compared it with preliminary morning data, then tested moisture levels with the palms of their hands to see if it could create dangerous slippage. Moisture was high, but not significantly different from usual days. If Marion had slipped here, the chance of finding handprints from trying to brace herself or heel skid marks would be quite high. But all surfaces remained uniformly smooth, with not a single scuff caused by human dragging force. At the foot of the staircase, right where the stone steps met the sand, police looked for the typical signs seen in ocean fall cases: slide marks from stone to sand, heavy body compression marks, or displaced footprints from attempts to regain balance. However, the sand here only showed the natural smooth patterns left by the receding tide, with no deep indentations suggesting major impact. If someone had fallen into the sea from the height just above the staircase, at minimum the sand would be disturbed, or the water nearby would show unusual foam. But none of that was present. One technical officer stepped back to observe the entire staircase from top to bottom to see if there was any spot where a falling person could tumble outward instead of straight down the steps. He scanned the stone edges on both sides, analyzing whether Marion could have slid sideways, struck an edge, and then fallen into the sea. But the staircase terrain was quite straight, with high, even stone walls on both sides, making it very difficult for someone to slide without leaving traces. These results led the investigation team to recognize one important thing: nothing on the stone staircase indicated that Marion had had an accident. If she had fallen, slide marks, impact signs, or something left behind would have to be present somewhere. But the staircase showed absolutely no corresponding signs. They began cross-referencing this finding with the appearance of the 3 pieces of evidence in the farther area and noticed a complete contradiction. The staircase area, the place where an accident was most probable, had no traces at all, while the evidence items were lying in places the tide could not have carried them to. One officer wrote in the report that the absence of any slip or fall signs on the staircase made the ocean accident scenario extremely difficult to match, because in every recorded fall into the sea case in this area, the scene always left at least some abrasion or impact mark. But here, not a single detail fit an accident. Upon completing the full examination of the stone staircase, from the upper path down to the point of contact with the beach sand, the technical team reached a preliminary conclusion. Marion left no signs indicating she slipped, was swept out to sea, or had an accident in the staircase area. The natural traces on the stone and sand were unchanged. There was no evidence of any sudden incident on the night she disappeared. This assessment was recorded as a crucial part of the crime scene examination and became a pivotal point when considering subsequent possibilities about what had happened to Marion Hale on the night she left the house and never returned. Immediately after the technical team concluded that the stone staircase area showed no signs that Marion had had an accident there, the on-scene commander decided to expand the search offshore, because if there were no traces on shore, the final remaining possibility still had to be checked. The scenario that Marion had fallen into the sea at a different location or been carried away by underwater currents. This required specialized assistance that the local police force in 1950 could not handle on their own. Due to the post-World War II period, when the U.S. military still maintained many operations in Hawaii, the police contacted the Navy Rescue Support Unit stationed at Pearl Harbor, requesting divers and a small vessel to help sweep the coastal waters beneath Diamond Head. Just a few hours after the request was sent, a team of divers and a small Coast Guard cutter arrived in the area, bringing diving gear and bottom-sweeping nets suitable for a missing person search. As the cutter dropped anchor not far from shore, the divers began assessing water depth and conditions. The tide was at mid-level, light current flowing westward, stable waves. These were favorable conditions for an underwater search without excessive silt being stirred up. The first 2 divers, wearing simple 1950 style diving suits with small air tanks and safety lines connected to the cutter, approached the water directly in front of the stone staircase. Even though there were no signs Marion had fallen there, this area still had to be swept as a mandatory elimination step. They descended to an average depth of about 3 to 5 meters, where the seabed was a mix of fine sand, small rocks, and sparse coral patches. Daylight penetrated sufficiently for close-range visibility, but they still used dive lights to examine under rock crevices carefully. The divers moved in a semicircular pattern, sweeping their lights over every angle and scanning each section in coordination with the cutter above. But after more than half an hour, they found no signs of clothing, hair, personal items, or a submerged body. When they surfaced, they reported that the seabed in this area was too clean to have retained a body overnight, which would have left some trace, however small. Immediately afterward, the second team of divers headed westward, where the rocky shore dropped off more steeply and the water was deeper. This was an area where, according to local residents, Marion sometimes walked, and because of the greater depth, if someone fell in here, a body could sink faster than near the staircase. They descended into deeper water layers, where the seabed consisted of sloping basalt rock and thinner sand. Shining their dive lights onto submerged rock faces, they looked for caught fabric scraps, tears, or anything held in rock grooves, but the results were the same. Nothing, except undisturbed sand layers. One diver used a probe to test the depth of a large rock crevice near the base of Diamond Head, where a small but steady whirlpool current existed. This crevice could trap light objects or clothing if sucked in. However, after repeatedly sweeping the light inside, they saw only a few broken coral pieces and old shells, nothing else. When reporting back to the cutter, they emphasized that if Marion had fallen into the sea from this side, the light but continuous whirlpool would have retained at least some clothing, but in reality nothing indicated that had happened. While the underwater team continued working, on the Coast Guard cutter the crew deployed a specialized dragnet with hooks along the seabed in lines parallel to the shore. This was a standard technique for nearshore missing person searches. The net would drag across the bottom, and the hooks could catch and touch anything lying underwater. Yet each time the net was hauled up, it contained only thin seaweed and sand, absolutely no fabric, hair, or foreign objects. The cutter moved a few hundred meters farther southwest, where the seabed terrain was more complex, with deep trenches that could retain objects for a long time. De Beers carefully descended to check each trench, but when their light swept across, they saw only attached seaweed and a thin layer of silt, no recent disturbance. One officer on the cutter asked the divers about the possibility that currents had pulled objects far away immediately after the night of disappearance, but based on current conditions and data from previous days, they confirmed that the flow in this area was light enough that at least one light object would have snagged somewhere close to shore and could not have vanished completely in just one night. When the search expanded eastward, an area less frequented by people, they encountered more jagged rock fields, forcing divers to be cautious while sweeping their lights close to the bottom. Here the submerged rocks were denser with many small niches, but like the previous two zones, the seabed was completely empty. No man-made objects appeared. This absolute absence puzzled both the police and the accompanying Navy team. An experienced diver commented that if a person had fallen into the sea at any point in this area, even dozens of meters offshore, the water and rocks could not possibly have failed to retain even a tiny sign, especially clothing or personal items. Yet every section of seabed was unusually clean, as if no one had fallen in for many days prior. As the search stretched close to noon, the cutter commander decided to perform one final net drag along the boundary where waves crashed hardest against the rocks. The net scraped the seabed, producing a faint metallic sound at each pass, but when hauled up it remained empty except for familiar seaweed patches. This was recorded in the report as evidence that the waters near the stone staircase, the western rocky area, and the expanded zones retained no signs related to Marion. When the underwater search team concluded its mission and the Coast Guard cutter departed the area, the summary report was sent back to the police team on shore with a clear conclusion: the entire seabed area where Marion might have walked or possibly fallen contained no body, no clothing, and no other evidence. All that was recovered was absolute emptiness. An emptiness that did not fit any previously recorded ocean accident scenario and made Marion Hale's disappearance even harder to explain from a purely natural perspective. When the report from the Navy divers and crew reached the temporary headquarters set up right near the stone staircase entrance, the on-scene commander decided to continue clarifying the still hazy links from the evening Marion went missing. And the first step was to re-interview Leonard, the last person to see her before she disappeared. Leonard was brought into a small room inside a neighbor's wooden house that had been requisitioned as a workspace and seated at a simple table temporarily covered with an area map. He still looked haggard after 2 sleepless nights, eyes red from sea wind and prolonged stress. The police asked him to recount the entire sequence of the evening from dinner until realizing Marion had not returned. Leonard began by describing a normal dinner. The 2 children had gone to bed early. Marion seemed a bit tired from a stressful shift at the medical station, but showed nothing else unusual. Afterward, she said she wanted to go down to the sea for some fresh air, a habit she had when feeling cooped up. Leonard said he thought that was normal and did not accompany her. The police asked the exact time Marion left the house. He answered around nearly 10 o'clock at night. When asked when he first felt she had been gone too long, Leonard said he didn't remember precisely, he just sat for a while, and when he next looked at the clock, it was past 1 in the morning. However, one officer pointed out that in his initial statement, Leonard had said he began worrying just after midnight. Leonard appeared flustered by the detail and explained that everything had happened quickly and he might have misremembered. The police noted it but did not press further to avoid distorting the statement. They continued asking about the last time Leonard saw Marion. He insisted he watched her walk down the stone steps. Light spilling from a neighbor's house allowed him to see part way, and he noticed nothing unusual. When asked whether Marion carried anything like a shawl, medicine, or personal items, Leonard stated she took nothing except a light jacket. This matched his initial statement, but indirectly contradicted the evidence found that morning. However, the police did not mention the evidence during this interview to avoid influencing Leonard's natural responses. Another question concerned what he did between the time Marion left and when he checked the beach. Leonard said he sat reading the newspaper in the living room, occasionally hearing waves, but no other sounds. When asked why he did not follow or check sooner, Leonard said he respected his wife's personal space and assumed she would only be out briefly as usual. The police recorded this response as reasonable given a family with no history of conflict. However, one officer noted in his log that Leonard showed a slight shift in describing the timeline. In his first answer, he said he began worrying when it was past 1, but later said he went out to the porch to look down at the sea around just after 12. This minor slip did not create direct suspicion, but was worth remembering because timeline consistency is always critical in missing person investigations. The police continued asking about the relationship between Leonard and Marion, whether there had been any recent arguments or tension. Leonard answered firmly that there had not been. They were living normally, though work sometimes made Marion tired. He also confirmed he stayed home the entire evening and never left. When asked to describe Marion's mental state before going down to the sea, Leonard said she was just a little tired, but not sad, stressed, or angry. This matched neighbors' testimony about her normal gait, but the unusual silence in the area afterward made everything harder to explain. The police asked further about Marion's walking habits, which direction she usually took, whether she often stopped at the Western Rocks or went farther. Leonard said she usually went down to the sand in front of the stone staircase and did not go far west or east. This differed from a neighbor's statement that morning, who said Marion sometimes walked along the rocks westward. When the police asked Leonard about that, he appeared surprised, but said she might have changed her habit without him noticing. The police noted this as a minor inconsistency, but not yet enough to be considered abnormal. The interview continued with more detailed questions about what Leonard heard or saw from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. Leonard said, besides the waves, he heard nothing else. No cries, no objects falling, no footsteps or calls from the beach. The police recorded that this matched the weather report. Wind that night was not strong. If a major incident occurred, someone on shore could have heard it. Yet because there was no sound, an accident became harder to imagine. When asked whether anyone in the house woke when Marion left, Leonard said the two children were sound asleep and no one else knew where she went. This was consistent with overall statements, but further reinforced that there were no witnesses inside the house at that time. After nearly an hour, the police summarized that Leonard's statement was generally consistent with initial information. The minor timeline contradictions could be due to stress and memory distortion, common in missing person cases. However, they still recorded the details, along with the small discrepancy about Marion's walking habits for later review. The first re-interview ended in a heavy atmosphere. Leonard walked out, looking bewildered, while the police knew that although nothing directly suspicious had emerged yet, the small gaps in his statement could become keys if subsequent witness accounts and evidence did not match perfectly. When Leonard left the interrogation room, the police decided to continue taking statements from the two children, hoping to uncover details that the adults might have inadvertently overlooked on the night Marion disappeared. Both were brought into the small room next door, where the window was left slightly open to let the sea breeze in, easing the tension in the air. The older child, about 11 years old, sat slightly hunched, while the younger one, around 8, clung tightly to his brother's hand. The police began with gentle questions to make them feel safe before gradually shifting to the timeline of that evening. The older one said they had gone to bed while it was still early. Their mother had come in to say goodnight as usual, and nothing seemed unusual. However, when asked if they had woken up at all during the night, both nodded. The younger one said he woke up around the middle of the night because he heard strong wind outside the window, but then added that he thought he also heard people speaking softly in the front room. The older one confirmed he heard it too, but described the sound as their parents talking in slightly hurried voices, not loud, not like a loud argument. When the police pressed for more specifics, neither child could recall the exact words. They only remembered that their mother's voice sounded mildly irritated or tired, while Leonard's was low and curt. The police asked whether they heard anything fall, a door slam or any kind of crashing sound, but both firmly said no, only the sound of conversation, and it lasted only a short time. One officer asked whether the voices happened before or after Marion left the house. The older child said he thought it was before, but when pressed to confirm he became confused and said he wasn't sure because he was sleepy. The younger one said that when he heard the voices, he still believed Mom was in the house, but when asked why he thought that, he just said, "I just thought so," without having seen her or heard footsteps. The lack of clarity was understandable. Children's memories upon just waking are often unreliable. Still, the police recorded everything because the detail of a late-night conversation could become crucial if it matched or contradicted the adult's statements. When asked about Marion's mood before they went to sleep, both said she seemed tired, but not sad or angry. The older one said Marion stroked their heads longer than usual, but wasn't sure what it meant. The younger one remembered that Mom said, "Go to sleep, I'm just stepping out for a bit and I'll be right back," a detail Leonard had never mentioned. The police noted that this was not a major contradiction, but it showed Marion had clearly intended to leave the house from the start, rather than making a sudden decision as Leonard described. When asked further about their mother's habits, the children said Marion sometimes walked down to the beach to relieve stress, but usually only for a few minutes before returning. Both were clear that they had never seen her stay out long at night. The police asked whether Marion was carrying the shawl the family usually used on windy nights, and both shook their heads, saying they didn't see her holding anything when she said goodnight. This drew particular attention because that shawl had been among the evidence collected that morning. When asked one last time about the voices they heard, the older child said he thought their parents were just discussing something related to Mom's work, since lately she had been bringing stress home from the clinic. The younger one only said Mom's voice didn't sound like when she reads stories, but couldn't explain more. After finishing the statements, the police tentatively concluded that the late-night conversation detail could be key, but wasn't yet strong enough to draw any conclusions. There was no indication the talk had turned serious or violent. No sounds of physical conflict, no unusual behavior from Leonard or Marion that the children noticed. Nevertheless, the fact that both heard sounds reflecting a conversation in the house just before Marion disappeared, something Leonard never mentioned in his interrogation, was recorded by police as a discrepancy to be checked further in subsequent steps, though at that moment it could not yet be considered truly suspicious. Immediately after completing the children's statements, the investigation team returned to their desks, piled with notes, maps, and scattered pieces of information. Now they faced a critical question. If Marion had truly fallen into the sea on the night she vanished, why were the items of evidence found in a location completely inconsistent with tidal patterns? To answer it, the police decided to conduct an in-depth tidal analysis using the 1950 U.S. Navy tide tables stored at the oceanography station near Pearl Harbor. An officer was sent to the unit's archive, where the tables were handwritten or printed on thin paper, listing day-by-day, hour-by-hour data on tide heights and surface current directions. When they cross-referenced the table for the night Marion disappeared, the results showed the water level was in a falling phase. The tide had begun receding around 9 p.m. and reached its lowest point around 3 a.m. This meant that if an object was dropped or fell into the water around the time Marion left the house, the current would pull it away from shore and then westward along the coastal flow. Yet the location where the evidence was discovered lay southeast of the stone stairs, completely opposite the recorded flow direction. A Navy officer present at the analysis confirmed that under those night's conditions, there was no natural circumstance that could push light items like a shawl or small floating objects into the sheltered area the search team had marked. If they had fallen into the sea, they would have been drawn outward and could not naturally drift back into a shallow rock crevice near the sand. A closer look at wave height and wind speed showed the sea that night was relatively calm, with light northeast winds, not strong enough to create unusual eddies that could reverse an object's drift. This contradicted the position of the evidence, because for the shawl and the two other items to end up precisely in that crevice, a direct and deliberate pushing force would have been required. One detective wrote in the report, "Evidence is located where the tide could not carry it unless placed there." This was the first official file entry hinting at possible human intervention, though not yet stated outright. The team also considered whether the items could have fallen from above and become lodged in the rocks. However, comparing the coastal topographic map, they saw the crevice was a considerable distance from the stone stairs, and the rock surface above the discovery site had no convenient access path. For something to fall straight down into that spot, a person standing above would have needed to reach the cliff edge, but that area had no trail or fresh footprints. Another officer suggested the shawl might have been caught on the rocks earlier, but this was dismissed because the shawl was completely dry, showing no signs of prolonged exposure or soaking. If it had been there for days, it would show wear or dampness, yet the fabric was clean and the colors still bright, indicating it had been placed recently. The other two items, a metal bowl and a small medicine bottle, were also dry, with no salt crust or sand adhesion, typical of objects that had floated in seawater. This forced the team to note that the evidence showed no effects of seawater exposure on the night Marion disappeared. They went on to deeper current tables, combining Navy and Honolulu weather station data. Every conclusion pointed the same way. No current that night could have carried the three items to the discovery site, especially since they were clustered within just a few yards of each other, a pattern incompatible with tidal movement that normally scatters objects in multiple directions. An experienced officer who had worked many coastal searches stated plainly that if Marion had accidentally fallen in, at least one personal item should have washed far out or appeared on the western shoreline, something the search teams never found. Instead, the items were concentrated in an area the tide could not reach that night, as if someone had placed them there shortly before discovery. The final note of the session was underlined in red ink. Drift direction per tide tables does not match evidence location. Natural accident scenario, inconsistent with hydrographic data. From that moment, even though the file had not yet officially shifted to another theory, the entire investigation began moving away from the sea accident hypothesis that had dominated the first 2 days. Marion Hale's disappearance was no longer regarded as a simple mishap, but as an event that natural laws could not fully explain, forcing the investigators to broaden their view toward possibilities never before mentioned in official reports. The tidal analysis conclusions compelled the team to expand the search inland, because if the ocean offered no trace of Marion, the possibility that something happened to her on land, or that she was taken elsewhere, could not be ignored. That same afternoon, a group of police and local militia was assigned to sweep the entire area around the stone stairs, starting with the low bushes along the trail leading down to the beach. The stiff shrubs with roots anchored deep in the soil would retain marks if a heavy object had been dragged through, yet after probing every section with wooden sticks and oil lamps, they found no freshly broken branches or unusual scrape marks. The search continued northward along the narrow strip of land hugging the base of Diamond Head. That path was sometimes used as a shortcut to neighboring houses, and the ground was still damp from night dew. Any fresh footprints would stand out clearly. yet the soil showed only old prints from local residents. No drag marks, no long skid trails, no sign anyone had tried to move a body. When an officer examined the rockiest sections where a struggle or push might leave scratches, they found only thin algae covering, no recent disturbance. The search moved into the nearby residential area, checking backyards with residents' permission. It was a quiet neighborhood, houses spaced moderately apart, low wooden fences easy to see over. Police walked the lanes between homes, shining lights into hidden corners, under eaves behind open window frames, along old fences that would show displacement if someone passed hurriedly. Everything remained undisturbed. Accumulated dust proved many spots had not been touched in a long time. One officer noted that dragging Marion would have left at least some interrupted trail, yet the area was completely clean. They continued eastward to a little-used side road, climbing the slope. That path had sharp rocks. Any dragging would leave obvious streaks, but the ground held only dry leaves and old gravel, nothing indicating heavy movement the night Marion vanished. When they checked the yards of the closest homes, they found no freshly disturbed soil or trampled grass. The team recorded that no concealed exit or hidden corner existed that could accommodate hiding a person or moving a heavy object without leaving traces. Even narrow passages behind houses, often covered by wind-blown sand, showed no suspicious interruptions. A seasoned detective remarked that transporting a body over land would leave at least one of three types of marks: scratched soil, compressed grass, or disturbed dust. Yet all three were absent. Finally, as the search party returned near the stone stairs in the late afternoon light, they summarized their observations: no drag marks, no fresh footprints leading away, no scraping or pushing signs on the ground, and no discarded items along the trails. This reinforced the conclusion that if Marion left the area in any direction, she neither walked the paths herself nor was dragged across the ground, because the soil and vegetation around remained intact after that night. The failure to find any evidence of movement on land made the case even more baffling. Marion left no trace in the sea, yet the land recorded absolutely no human or object impact from that time. When the land search yielded nothing, the team began re-examining small details previously given insufficient attention, including Leonard's shoes, an item that seemed insignificant but might reveal where he had actually gone the night Marion disappeared. Initially, Leonard's shoes had only been noted in passing during the general inspection, since he claimed he stayed home all evening and there was no reason yet to doubt him. However, with the land completely clean of traces, one officer suggested a close look at the sand still clinging to the soles when Leonard came to the temporary headquarters the morning after the disappearance. Using the crude 1950 techniques, no specialized microscope or modern chemical analysis, the police could only use a metal tray, white paper, and a handheld magnifying glass to examine each grain. They asked Leonard to surrender the shoes he wore that night, and when he did, they noted a thin but visible layer of sand on the soles. The officers gently tapped the shoes so the sand fell onto the tray, then angled sunlight to highlight color and grain structure. They compared it directly with samples collected from the beach directly below the stone stairs, the place Marion usually went each evening. Beach sand there was pale yellow, fine, soft, and rounded from constant wave action. In contrast, the sand from Leonard's shoes was grayish-brown, coarser, some grains angular, mixed with tiny basalt fragments, characteristics typical of rocky shores or areas less affected by waves. The officers immediately recognized the difference. One suggested comparing it to sand from the rocky beach west of Diamond Head, but even that sand, though containing basalt, had been polished by seawater and showed a characteristic sheen. Leonard's sand lacked that sheen, indicating little or no prolonged seawater contact. Another likely area was the weathered soil and rock dust on the slopes along little-used paths behind the residences, where Marion never walked. Police sent someone to collect control samples from 2 such trails, and when brought back, the trail sand was poured beside the shoe sample, revealing striking similarity in color, grain size, and basalt content. This raised a major question. If Leonard truly never left the house the night his wife vanished, why did his shoes carry sand not from the stone stairs area or the beach, where he said he searched for Marion? When questioned, Leonard insisted he only searched the sandy area at the foot of the stairs, never went elsewhere, and stayed close to the water. He also said the sand could be from the previous day when he did chores behind the house. But police noted the soil behind Leonard's house was mostly fine dirt and small gravel, not matching the basalt-rich sample. Another officer proposed the sand might have stuck from the side path when Leonard frantically searched for his wife, but that path was covered with crushed white coral laid by neighbors to prevent slipping, no basalt sand there. The mismatch between the sand on Leonard's shoes and the sand from anywhere he claimed to have been led the team to enter in the record sand sample does not match Marion's usual area or the declared search zone. Still, they remained cautious, because a single detail like this could not prove Leonard went elsewhere, especially given the varied geology around Diamond Head, where daily activity could mix sands. Nevertheless, the discrepancy added another layer of doubt. Either Leonard had unknowingly walked through an area with different sand, or his account of his movements that night contained errors. After the analysis, police sealed the sand sample in a paper envelope and numbered it for possible future comparison. In the day's final report, the lead officer noted that although the legal significance was not yet clear, the fact that the sand did not match any location on Marion's usual route had caused them to begin questioning the simplicity of the accident scenario, once again raising the question of what really happened the night Marion disappeared. While the police were still examining the meaning of the sand sample on Leonard's shoes, a new piece of information unexpectedly emerged from a local resident, forcing the investigation team to temporarily shift their analytical focus. A middle-aged man living in the area about 2 blocks from the stone stairs came to the temporary headquarters that afternoon, saying he wanted to provide a statement because he might have seen something on the night Marion disappeared. At first, the investigation team didn't expect much. Most witnesses who came forward on their own in missing persons cases had only heard noises or had vague feelings. But when the man said he had seen an unusually strong burst of light right at the stone stairs area during a time frame close to when Marion left the house, the room suddenly fell silent. The police asked him to describe exactly what he saw. He explained that he couldn't sleep that night and went for a walk near the shoreline, a habit he kept whenever he couldn't fall asleep. It was quite dark because clouds were covering the moon. There were only scattered lights from the oil lamps on people's porches shining down onto the path. When he reached a point about 30 meters from the stone stairs, he suddenly saw a strong flash coming from below the stairs, a sharp white light, much brighter than the oil lamps or any flashlight of that era. He emphasized that the light seemed to switch on suddenly and then turn off immediately, lasting less than a second. He heard no accompanying sound and saw no figures, because from where he stood he couldn't see all the way down the stone steps. At first he thought it might be a lightning flash reflecting off the water, but when he looked more closely, there was no storm or lightning that night. The air was calm and there was no strong wind, nothing that matched any natural phenomenon capable of producing such a flash. When the police asked the exact time he saw the light, he said it was after it was completely late at night, but before he heard the first rooster, an imprecise description, but one that fit the reality of 1950s Hawaii, when clocks were not common in every household. Based on the route he usually walked and the time he left home, the police tentatively determined the light appeared sometime between 11 o'clock and nearly midnight, within the window when Marion was believed to still be out on the beach. When asked whether he had ever seen similar light in that area before, the man shook his head firmly. He said that light was unlike any lamp used by people in the neighborhood, and also unlike the lights from fishing boats offshore, because fishing boats usually had yellow or orange lights, not the intense white light that cut through the darkness like the one he witnessed. The police immediately re-examined the stair area for any traces that could explain the source of the light, but they found no reflective metal, glass fragments or objects capable of producing the intense flash the witness described. When they tried to replicate the light using the most powerful flashlight available at the time, they realized that no civilian light source along the coast in 1950 was bright enough to create a similar effect. This forced them to ask a difficult question: could the light have come from someone using a large military-grade flashlight, something not common in a residential area? However, the witness only saw a single flash, not continuous illumination. One officer wondered if it could have been a night fisherman using a signal light, but the witness insisted he saw no one, and the water at the base of the stairs was too shallow for a boat to approach closely. They asked the witness again about the direction of the light, and he described it as shining diagonally upward from below the rocks, not downward from the shore. This ruled out the possibility that the light originated from a house in the neighborhood. When asked why he hadn't reported it that same night, he said that at the time he didn't think anything was unusual, until the next morning when he heard Marion had disappeared and began to suspect a connection. The police recorded this statement in the file, classifying it as an unverified detail, because although it was valuable for timing and location, it was not accompanied by any sound, movement, or identification of a person. However, the final note in this section emphasized that the statement about the intense burst of light at the stone stairs at the exact time of Marion's disappearance did not match any natural element or ordinary daily activity of local residents, making her disappearance even harder to explain as a simple accident. Although the statement about the strange light was carefully recorded and treated as an important detail requiring further consideration, the investigation team still had to face the reality that there was no concrete evidence allowing them to take a clear next step. There was no body of Marion, no signs she had been swept out to sea, no drag marks on land, no unfamiliar footprints outside the stair area, and no direct witness who saw her after she left the house. The only physical items found, the shawl, the metal bowl, and the pill bottle, were in locations that completely contradicted tidal data and drift patterns, preventing them from serving as evidence to determine the cause or location of an accident. Leonard's statement had minor timing discrepancies, but nothing sufficient to treat as clear suspicion, and the children's account of hearing conversation inside the house showed no signs of conflict or violence. The witness to the intense light could only provide a phenomenon, not an action, and no one else corroborated anything similar. After many days of expanded searches, both at sea and on land, the participating forces were exhausted while results remained zero. The complete absence of any physical trace forced the police to consider that everything that could be investigated at the moment had already been done, and no further realistic methods suitable to 1950s technology remained to continue expanding the effort. In the final summary meeting at the temporary station set up near the residential area, the officers reported that, although many unclear details remained unexplained, no element reached the threshold necessary to open a criminal or accidental investigation with certainty. Everything existed only as unverified speculation. An internal report was prepared stating that the Marion Hale file would be temporarily shifted to insufficient evidence status, a common outcome for missing persons cases of that era, when search technology was limited and the absence of a body almost always meant no conclusion could be reached. Active investigation was halted, personnel gradually withdrew from the area, and temporary notice boards were taken down. The file was closed in an undetermined state, no evidence of accident, no evidence of crime, no evidence that Marion was alive or dead. For the coastal community of Honolulu, this was an unresolved ending. And for the police department, it was simply one of many missing persons cases that had to be stopped because nothing more could be done. The decision to suspend the investigation was made, and just days later, the entire search force was pulled from the Diamond Head coastal area, marking an unwanted turning point. The Marion Hale case was officially classified as a cold case, an unsolved file due to lack of evidence. This was the final step in the procedure for missing persons cases without a body in 1950s Hawaii, when all field efforts, witness cross-checking, and analysis of natural conditions could no longer produce a breakthrough. At Honolulu PD headquarters, a group of officers was tasked with finalizing the official file. They compiled all reports from land search teams, underwater teams, and military units, copied the statements from Leonard, the two children, and the witness to the strange light, along with hand-drawn maps simulating walking routes, wind directions, tidal data, and diagrams of the area where evidence was recovered. The physical items, the shawl, metal bowl, and pill bottle, were sealed in brown paper envelopes, closed with wax seals, and the signature of the responsible officer. Those envelopes were then placed in a small wooden box, assigned file number, and sent to the department's evidence storage room. Inside were notes clearly stating the condition of the items, recovery locations, and remarks: no watermarks, no sea sand, no signs of natural drifting. A copy of the investigation file was placed in the main filing cabinet of the Detective Division, among numerous other post-war missing persons cases. The Marion Hale file was coded C-1103 and stamped insufficient evidence. Investigation temporarily suspended. Though no one said it aloud, closing the Marion file created a heavy silence in the office. A young officer, who had personally participated in many days of coastal searching, stared at the red line on the final page. Victim status undetermined. To him, this wasn't just a file being put away. It was a mother who vanished from her family without leaving any trace. But procedure had to be completed. The file was placed in the third drawer, locked with an old metal key, and the key returned to the administrative office. From that moment, the Marion Hale case was no longer part of active investigation. Any future action would require new information or new evidence, if any ever appeared. There were no more special patrol teams, no more emergency meetings, no more maps covered in notes. What remained was only a thin folder, a few unusually dry pieces of evidence, and questions no one could answer. In the closing note, the lead investigator wrote a short line: "Case contains many unexplained elements, but no evidence to continue." When the filing cabinet was closed, the Marion Hale case became one of dozens of coastal disappearances in Hawaii from that era. Cases the community never forgot, but that law enforcement had to accept stopping. However, even though the case was officially moved to cold case status, Marion Hale's disappearance continued to linger in the memories of those living near Diamond Head, a story not yet closed, merely filed away waiting for the day it might be opened again. Nearly half a century after the Marion Hale file was placed in storage, the investigative environment at Honolulu PD had changed dramatically. Matching technologies, environmental analysis, and cold case review procedures had all been upgraded, and a cold case review unit was established to handle unresolved cases. When the newly formed unit began screening the backlog of files from the 1940s, 1960s, the Marion Hale case quickly drew attention, not because of fame or scale, but because of the unusual details flagged right in the original reports, especially the evidence locations that did not match title patterns. A team of 3 investigators was assigned to re-examine this file in the first review wave. When they opened box number C-1103, they noticed that the 1950 notes were remarkably detailed regarding natural environment factors. Red ink annotations left by the original officer about inconsistent currents and evidence unaffected by seawater led the team to conclude this was not a typical disappearance. The investigators re-evaluated the initial process and found many elements inconsistent with an accident scenario, such as no traces of a fall on the stone stairs, the complete absence of appropriate drifting objects, and especially the unusually dry condition of the recovered items. One investigator wondered why the case had been closed so quickly as insufficient evidence instead of pursuing a criminal angle, but after reviewing the 1950s context, lack of crime scene technology, lack of analytical data, lack of specialized investigative manpower, they understood that closing the file then had been the only realistic choice. However, the current cold case team was not bound by those limitations. They re-examined every page of statements, highlighting inconsistencies such as the minor argument the children overheard, the mismatched sand on Leonard's shoes, and the statement about the intense light. Elements previously treated only as insufficient evidence now became grounds to reassess the possibility of human intervention. When reviewing the hand-drawn map marking evidence locations, one investigator paid particular attention to the detailed description, shawl lying in a rock crevice unreachable by that night's tide. This stood in sharp contrast to most coastal disappearances of the era, where personal items were typically found along the beach or at the water's edge. The fact that all three key items were dry, free of sea sand, and clustered in an enclosed area led the review team to conclude that the Marion Hale case exhibited a far higher degree of irregularity than other disappearances from the same period. In the first evaluation meeting, the cold case unit leader requested that this file be treated as a priority because the number of suspicious details exceeded the norm. An internal document was prepared stating, "Marion Hale case, highly likely not an accident. Recommend opening Phase 2 review." This meant the file would be removed from evidence storage, fully re-examined using all available modern methods, and every detail reassessed according to current investigative standards. When the evidence custodian opened the cabinet and retrieved the dust-covered box, no one in the team said a word. They understood this was not just an old file being revisited, it was a mystery that had slept for decades, and now with the emergence of the cold case unit, would be brought back into the light, starting from the smallest traces that seemed long forgotten. As the cold case team began expanding their review to documents outside the official file, an unexpected event occurred. While a Honolulu PD logistics crew was demolishing an old warehouse behind headquarters, a wooden structure built in the 1940s and scheduled for demolition to make way for new construction, they discovered a rotten wooden crate containing many yellowed documents mixed among empty ammunition boxes and old military gear. A young officer checking the papers happened upon a thin notebook with a peeling leather cover on which faded ink read "Rescue Log, 1950. Recognizing the date matched the Marion Hale case, he immediately brought the notebook to the cold case team. When they opened it, the investigators realized it was a handwritten log kept by a coastal rescue group that had assisted HPD in post-World War II disappearances, recorded by a man named R.L. Kawika. The notebook was not on any official submission list, probably because the rescue group kept it for internal use and never turned it in. This made its contents especially significant as it contained on-scene observations never mentioned in the 1950 file. In the middle pages, the cold case team found an entry directly related to the night Marion disappeared. The top recorded the date March 14, 1950, matching the timeline in the official file. R.L. Kawika described how his team arrived at the Diamond Head area to assist police in searching along the shore. What caught the investigators' attention was not the search descriptions, those matched the official file, but a section below underlined more heavily. Compass showed abnormal wave direction, off by about 20-25 degrees from expected wind direction. Near-shore current not moving west as per tide tables, but drifting slightly southeast, only in the section near the rock crevice where we noticed strange sand disturbance. Cause unknown. The cold case team lingered over this detail for a long time. In the official 1950 file, wave and current reports unanimously stated the sea was calm that night, with a westerly flow matching the tide tables. There was no mention whatsoever of abnormal currents. Yet the log described something entirely different. The rescue team's compass showed water drifting slightly southeast, exactly matching the location where evidence was later found. One investigator immediately cross-checked the area map and realized southeast was the one direction that night's tide could not have produced. According to Navy data, this suggested either the tide table had been misread, or the rescue team recorded an anomaly the 1950 investigators ignored. Or worse, the evidence was already there before the rescue team arrived. And the local current did not reflect natural movement, but rather localized disturbance caused by someone moving objects. Turning the page, the cold case team discovered an even more surprising detail. In the leaving notes section, Kawika wrote, "Rock crevice where the shawl was found, looked like minor soil disturbance, not caused by waves. Suspect someone stepped down to the rock edge before the tide rose. But police said preserve the scene, no conclusions. This was the first direct record that the crevice containing evidence showed disturbance inconsistent with ocean movement. In the official file, this detail was completely absent. The 1950 investigators only noted evidence locations, not causation. One cold case investigator commented that if the rescue team saw disturbance but was not allowed to include it in the official file, the original team may have wanted to avoid speculation or lacked grounds to pursue a criminal angle. But for the current cold case team, that note became crucial evidence. If the crevice was disturbed before evidence was collected, it was highly likely someone placed the items there. The notebook also contained a short practical analysis. Kawika wrote, "If items drifted through water, they should show wetness or salt residue." But the shawl was completely dry. The metal bowl was neither cold nor had salt frost. Felt like they were here before the tide came in. These descriptions stunned the cold case team. They further confirmed the suspicion that the evidence did not drift in from the sea, but was placed in the crevice within a very narrow window close to when searchers discovered it. When the log notes were combined with reanalyzed tidal data, the team noticed a strange alignment. The abnormal southeast drift Kawika recorded matched exactly the direction the evidence could not have naturally reached under that night's conditions. This led to an important conclusion. The abnormal current may not have been a natural phenomenon, but the result of human activity accessing the crevice, lightly stirring a small amount of water, and causing the compass deviation. Not enough to create new waves, but enough for a keen observer to notice. One cold case investigator said quietly in the room, "If this record is accurate, someone placed the evidence in that crevice within the initial search window." The notebook provided one more small but confirming detail. On the last page related to the Marion case, Kawika wrote, "None of us in the group carried large flashlights. The strong flash seen nearby could not have come from the rescue team." This corroborated the witness statement about the intense light, proving the source could not have been the rescue group or police. With multiple matching records, the notebook became the first clear evidence that Marion's items were not brought to their discovery locations by the tide, but were intentionally placed there within a very short period between her disappearance and the arrival of search teams. This was something the official 1950 file never directly recorded, and now the cold case team regarded it as the first evidence strong enough to completely undermine the coastal accident hypothesis. The old logbook, seemingly discarded in a rotting warehouse, unexpectedly became the key to unlocking an entirely new chain of questions, and for the first time in decades, the Marion Hale case began moving out of the shadows of ambiguity into a more directed phase of investigation. After the 1950 rescue team's logbook provided anomalous data regarding wave direction, sand disturbance points, and the timing of the evidence appearing in the rock crevice, the cold case team decided to remove all the sealed evidence from that year out of storage for reanalysis using modern technology. When the evidence box was opened in the HPD forensics lab, 3 items were placed on the glass table: the beige shawl, the small metal bowl, and the glass vial with the faded old label. All remained perfectly preserved thanks to decades of dry storage conditions, which unintentionally created ideal circumstances for modern experts to analyze material structure, salt deposition, and microtraces. First, the forensics team scanned the shawl using an electron microscope. Thanks to extreme magnification capability, they could see the fabric's fiber structure layer by layer, something 1950 technology could never achieve. Upon examination, they discovered a number of fibers pulled horizontally, perpendicular to the weave direction, creating uniform, parallel abrasion streaks. This characteristic did not match natural wave action, which causes chaotic, random abrasion and never produces such parallel lines. One examiner confirmed that these abrasion marks were consistent with rubbing against a hard, flat-edged object, such as rock or a hard surface, lightly scraped across the fabric. This matched Kawika's note about ground lot disturbance not caused by waves, Continuing to examine the shawl's edges, the team found additional microfibers crushed in a top-to-bottom direction, as if the shawl had been pressed against a hard stone surface. This reinforced the likelihood that the shawl had been placed rather than dragged into the crevice by seawater. Next, they analyzed the sea salt on the shawl using energy-dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. The results showed virtually zero salt crystals, only a few particles too small to quantify accurately. If the shawl had been in contact with seawater for even a few minutes or lay in the splash zone, seawater would have left characteristic crystallization. Yet the shawl had none, matching the 1950 report that it was completely dry when recovered. Modern analysis, however, confirmed the dryness went beyond the surface to the microscopic level. The shawl had been placed in the crevice without prior seawater contact. Next was the metal bowl. The team examined surface scratches using high-resolution laser scanning. They found long horizontal abrasion marks that did not follow the direction of receding water or typical wave impact. The scratches shared the same angle and depth, as if the bowl had slid horizontally across dry rock without water present. On the rim was a clear, light sliding mark with a distinct start and stop point, proving active, deliberate movement rather than passive transport by currents. The technician explained that if waves had repeatedly slammed the bowl against rock, the scratches would show tiny serrated patterns from back-and-forth oscillation. Instead, the marks were clean, continuous, and unidirectional, hallmarks of controlled movement. Chemical analysis of the bowl's surface showed no sea salt residue and no oxidation pattern typical of prolonged exposure to salt water and salty air. According to the lab's simulation, even 24 hours near the ocean would produce detectable micro-oxidation. This bowl showed none, proving it was never near the sea throughout the night. Marion disappeared. Finally, the glass vial. The team examined dust layers, surface structure, and exposure to salt vapor. They found a fine dust layer that was not marine dust and contained no salt. Moreover, the glass showed no corrosion etching from salt vapor. One expert stated, "This vial never experienced significant exposure to sea air moisture and certainly did not spend the night at the shoreline." A few tiny sand grains adhered to the vial's base, but analysis revealed they were basalt sand from the area behind the rocky ridge, not the fine golden beach sand. This matched the earlier finding on Leonard's shoes and the conclusion that the evidence had contacted an inland rocky area, not the water's edge. Another critical step was analyzing the dust distribution and microparticle pattern across all three items. When compared, the team found identical dust adhesion patterns, dry terrestrial dust containing no salt particles and exhibiting characteristics more consistent with residential area dust than ocean spray. Most notably, all three items had equivalent dust levels, proving they had been in the same environment before being placed in the crevice. If the items had drifted in from the sea, dust adhesion would vary widely depending on exposure to sand, waves, and water. Uniform dust proved they were placed simultaneously in a single act. An invited crime scene reconstruction expert simulated the forces needed to produce the horizontal scratches on the bowl and shawl. Results showed only two plausible scenarios. Either someone knelt close to the crevice and slid the items horizontally into place, or someone standing on the ledge gently lowered them into position. Both scenarios confirmed human placement, not the ocean. When all results were compiled, the cold case team met to issue the official conclusion. The report exceeded 20 pages. The summary highlighted three key points. 1. None of the items bore traces of seawater contact, salt vapor, or beach sand. 2. All items displayed horizontal scratching, consistent with deliberate dry rock contact. 3. Dust adhesion levels and microparticle characteristics proved the items shared the same environment before placement in the crevice. The lab's overall conclusion read, "The evidence was not the result of a marine accident, was not flotsam, and was not washed in by waves. The collection of evidence was staged in the crevice by human action." As the lead examiner signed the final report, he said one sentence that silenced the room. "If the evidence was placed, Someone was standing in that crevice the exact night Marion disappeared. For the first time in over half a century, the Marion Hale case officially moved out of the realm of accident and into the territory of suspected human foul play, a completely new direction for a cold case long thought permanently asleep. Immediately after the modern forensics report confirmed the evidence had been staged, the cold case team summoned Leonard Hale for a second interview, this time under circumstances where he was no longer a neutral informant, but a person directly connected to the newly discovered anomalies. Leonard, now an elderly man, was invited to HPD headquarters under the pretext of supplementing information for the historical file, but the investigators knew this meeting would be a pivotal turning point. When Leonard sat at the interview table, he appeared calmer than in years past, yet his shifting eyes when he saw the evidence box on the table revealed he understood today's conversation would be different. The team began by asking him to recount the entire sequence of the night Marion disappeared, exactly as he had in 1950. Leonard paused, then claimed he no longer remembered as clearly because of the passage of time. Yet when he started speaking, the details he provided did not match his original 1950 statement. He now said Marion left the house a little after 9 p.m., whereas the 1950 record quoted him saying near midnight. When reminded of the original statement, Leonard looked flustered, gave an awkward smile, and corrected himself to maybe around 11. The investigators clearly noted these continual adjustments as signs he was tailoring his story rather than recalling naturally. The investigators pressed on the period Leonard was alone in the house before realizing Marion was missing. This time he claimed he went out on the porch multiple times to look toward the ocean, directly contradicting his original statement that he only began searching near dawn. When asked why in 1950, he said he stayed inside most of the time. Leonard replied that he had probably forgotten that detail. The discrepancies in critical timelines caused the team to note that Leonard's memory was not merely faded, but changing in ways difficult to explain. Next, they asked why his shoes contained basalt sand from the area behind the rocky ridge rather than from the beach below the stone stairs, where he claimed to have searched. Leonard visibly faltered and answered that he might have walked the wrong way in panic. But the team immediately reminded him that in 1950, he insisted he only searched the beach and never went up any other path. When asked whether he had walked onto the ridge behind the residential area where the basalt sand originated, Leonard said, "I don't remember," but a flash of tension crossed his face that the investigators did not miss. The crux came with the physical evidence. The investigators placed the shawl, bowl, and vial on the table and informed him that forensics had determined all three items had never contacted seawater, bore no salt, and showed horizontal sliding marks created by human action. When asked directly whether he knew why his wife's belongings appeared in the crevice in a staged manner, Leonard did not answer immediately. He stared at the shawl for a long time, then said he didn't understand what happened. The investigator then asked the most critical question: did Leonard leave the house at any point that night to go down to the beach or behind the residential area? Leonard bit his lip and replied that he might have gone outside while panicking, but didn't remember where. This was the first time Leonard admitted leaving the house that night, an admission completely contrary to his firm 1950 denials. The team immediately asked why in 1950 he completely denied leaving the house if he now said he might have wandered outside. Leonard could not explain, only repeating that back then I was in shock and didn't remember. The investigators continued pressing about the strong beam of light witnesses saw from the stone stairs at a time Leonard claimed to be inside the house. When asked whether he took a large flashlight outside, Leonard said no, but the hesitation in his voice led the investigators to note clear inconsistency. Later, when asked why he did not call neighbors or police sooner after Marion had been gone nearly 2 hours, Leonard only said, "I thought she would come back," but his eyes avoided contact, lacking the confidence of previous interviews. When the team explained that the evidence was placed in the crevice within a very narrow time window, the same night Marion disappeared, and before searchers arrived, Leonard fell silent for nearly half a minute, far too long for a normal reaction. The investigators recorded that silence as a psychological indicator that Leonard had been struck at a point he could not explain. At the end, when asked one final time whether he knew anyone who could have accessed the crevice that night, Leonard said quietly, "No one, only Marion and I were awake then." Although not a confession, that answer caused the team to internally flag him as the primary suspect. The post-interview report concluded, Leonard's statements changed on multiple key points from the 1950 record. He cannot explain leaving the house that night. He provided no reasonable explanation for the sand samples, staged evidence, or timeline discrepancies. Recommendation: upgrade Leonard Hale to primary suspect in the 1950 disappearance. After the second interview with Leonard produced numerous inconsistencies, the cold case team decided to recontact the two children from the original file, now both adults, because the passage of time sometimes clarifies memories of details once overlooked. Ava Hale, the youngest child in 1950, was now in her 60s and living in Hilo. When invited to provide a new statement, she was surprised but cooperative, saying she had always felt something was wrong that night, but was too young at the time to express it fully. The session took place in a quiet interview room with Ava facing two investigators and the evidence box at the end of the table. When asked to recount everything she remembered about the night Marion left, Ava closed her eyes for a long moment and said her memories were fragmented, but certain fragments remained vivid. The first thing she mentioned was a sound, a loud noise from the front room where Marion and Leonard usually talked. She said, "I remember that sound clearly. It wasn't someone falling or a door slamming, it was like something heavy hitting the wall." The investigators exchanged glances. This was a completely new detail absent from Ava's 1950 statement when she was a child. She explained that back then she thought the noise was unimportant because no one asked follow-up questions, and she herself was too scared to speak clearly. Ava continued that after the noise, she heard urgent whispering between her parents, a tone unlike normal conversation, unusually tense. When asked if she could make out words or whose voice was louder, Ava said Marion's voice was low and clipped, while Leonard's was very soft, as if trying to hide something. When asked if she was certain the noise occurred before her mother left, Ava answered without hesitation, "Absolutely. I only heard Mom's footsteps leaving after the noise." She added that she heard Marion open the closet to get a jacket, but did not hear her take the familiar shawl. At that point, Ava looked toward the evidence box and said something that made the investigators stop writing. "My mother's shawl, it was still hanging in the bedroom that night. I remember, because Mom always wore that shawl when she went to the beach, and that night the shawl closet wasn't touched." The investigators asked again to confirm this was not a confused memory. Ava firmly insisted. When Mom went out, the shawl was still in the room in its usual place. "I saw it while sitting on the bed after the noise woke me." This directly contradicted the 1950 assumption that the recovered shawl was the one Marion took with her. With this statement, the nature of the shawl found in the crevice changed completely. If Marion did not take it to the beach, the shawl could only have reached the crevice through someone else's hands. Ava continued that shortly after Marion left, Leonard entered the children's room. She remembered him, standing motionless in the doorway for a moment, breathing heavily, then saying everything was fine. At the time she didn't understand the tension in his voice, but as an adult, she believed he had not been truthful. When asked whether she saw her father leave the house right after that, she said she didn't remember exactly, but she clearly recalled the door opening again. Not the heavy sound, when Marion left, but a soft closing, as if someone deliberately avoided noise. This matched the basalt sand on Leonard's shoes, and his changed statement in the second interview that he might have gone outside, but didn't remember where. The investigators shifted to the metal bowl and glass file. Ava pressed her lips together for a moment, then said she did not recall seeing those two items in the house that evening. But she remembered one thing her mother always did. Marion always kept the vial in the wooden box beside the bed and never took it on walks. When asked whether she ever saw the vial again after that night, she said no, but she clearly remembered the bedside cabinet was left slightly open the morning after Marion disappeared. That detail again aligned with the forensic conclusion that the vial never contacted seawater and was placed in the crevice after leaving an indoor environment. Ava also noted the living room was slightly messier than usual the next morning, though as a child, she didn't understand the significance. When asked about footsteps, did she hear anyone go down the stone stairs? Ava shook her head. No. If Mom went, I usually heard the front door and footsteps because the floor creaked. But that night, everything was very quiet after Mom left. The investigators noted that silence contradicted Leonard's claim of going out to the yard multiple times to look. According to Ava's memory, there were no male footsteps passing the children's room while she was still awake. As the interview ended, Ava looked at the evidence box one last time and said she always suspected those items didn't belong there. She didn't know how they ended up in the crevice, but she was certain they did not leave the house with her mother. Ava's statement reinforced the possibility the cold case team had already begun to favor after the forensic results. The evidence scene was deliberately staged. More importantly, Ava's testimony, matching multiple new findings, shifted suspicion to the one point the 1950 file had overlooked. The last person alone with Marion inside the house was the person most capable of staging the scene and manipulating the evidence. After Ava's testimony strengthened the hypothesis that the shawl and other items found in the crevice never left the house with Marion, the cold case team moved to the final verification step regarding the marine environment, the aspect once considered the cornerstone of the 1950 file. Through collaboration between Honolulu PD and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, they requested a detailed simulation of currents, wind, and tides for the entire night of Marion's disappearance, reconstructed using hindcast meteorological data. NOAA specialists entered all necessary variables into the system. Wind speeds recorded at Honolulu Airport in 1950, sea surface temperature, Diamond Head seabed topography, tidal amplitude differences, and nearshore current data from post-war military records. The simulation ran for nearly an hour. When complete, the current map displayed on screen revealed a truth so clear, the cold case team barely needed further explanation. At the time Marion left the house, currents flowed west at low but steady intensity. Around midnight the tide began falling sharply, pulling any small objects far offshore. NOAA's simulation clearly illustrated how light objects would behave. 80% probability of being carried west-southwest, 15% of becoming trapped in submerged rocks below the stone stairs, and only 5% remaining in high-tide crevices. But NOAA highlighted one critical section in red. The crevice where the evidence was found sat 60-80 centimeters above the night's high tide mark. That meant the tide that night could not reach the crevice, let alone deposit anything inside. For certainty, the engineers ran a second simulation, assuming wind twice as strong and waves higher than historical records, an extreme scenario. The outcome remained unchanged. No current model could deliver the shawl, bowl, or vial to the discovered location. NOAA continued simulating light object movement based on material properties. The shawl, whether wet or dry, could never move against the current into the southeast zone. The heavier metal bowl had only two possible behaviors: sink straight down or drift diagonally westward. No simulation placed the bowl in a high, sheltered crevice, matching the actual site. The vial simulation was even clearer. Its round shape and narrow neck would cause strong spinning and zigzag collision in water, certainly producing chips or abrasion. Yet forensic results showed the vial completely intact, proving it never experienced violent water movement. When NOAA issued the official report, the sole conclusion was printed in bold. No tidal or current scenario under any simulated condition could have delivered the evidence to the position recorded in the 1950 file. That location lay outside the hydrological influence of the night in question. The cold case team read those words in prolonged silence. With modern scientific data, they now possessed what 1950 could never prove. The evidence did not come from the sea, did not drift, was not washed in by waves. It was placed, deliberately, and placed precisely within the time frame that coincided with Marion vanishing from the shoreline below Diamond Head. The NOAA-tied conclusion forced the cold case team to re-examine every marginal document from 1950 that had been ignored or considered secondary at the time, and during that cross-referencing process, one piece of information buried in an old civil file suddenly stood out: Leonard Hale's injury treatment record from a private clinic near Kaimuki, completed just a few hours after he reported his wife missing. According to the notes of the doctor on duty that night, Leonard was admitted with sharp pain in the left knee, mild swelling on the outer side, signs of abnormal twisting, and he requested only simple compression bandaging. The record also noted that he arrived alone and stated that he had slipped on the stone stairs while running to look for his wife, an explanation the doctor did not flag as unusual because in 1950 the Lanikai and Diamond Head areas still had many rough stone steps that commonly caused twisted ankles. However, when this record was placed alongside the NOAA conclusion and the 1950 crime scene report, a clear inconsistency emerged from day one. The search teams recorded no trace of a slip, no freshly broken stone, no scrape marks on the stairs leading down to the sea. The stair surface was completely dry, with no deep footprints or long skid marks consistent with a fall severe enough to cause a twisting knee injury. This led the cold case team to question whether the injury actually occurred at the location Leonard had claimed. A forensic medical expert was brought in to consult, reviewed the 1950 injury description, and gave a preliminary assessment. An external twisting injury to the left knee is commonly seen in lateral impacts or when the victim resists while being pulled backward, completely inconsistent with a forward fall on stone steps. Notably, the medical report also stated the skin over the knee showed no significant abrasion, only swelling from torsional force, a description that further reduced the likelihood that Leonard fell on a rough stone surface. When the cold case team compared timelines, they discovered that Leonard visited the clinic during the exact window he had vaguely described in his initial 1950 interview. The period he claimed he was searching around the beach, yet no witness ever confirmed seeing him near the water's edge. This raised a larger question: if no one saw Leonard searching, and if his injury did not match the terrain of the stairs or beach, where did the injury actually happen? While re-examining the original scene records, investigators also noted a detail overlooked in 1950. Leonard's shoes contained fine-grained sand mixed with tiny coral fragments, not the coarse sand from the beach, where Marion usually walked, but the type found on the north side of Diamond Head, an area with many sheltered rock coves and little foot traffic. In 1950, police did not connect this to Leonard's injury, but in the current context, his presence in a completely different area from the one he claimed could be related to the cause of the injury. A crime scene analyst stated that if the injury resulted from a struggle, the victim's leg could accidentally be twisted during a scuffle, especially if pushed backward against rock or pulled off balance. The cold case team began treating that possibility as a working hypothesis because it matched the degree of swelling, the direction of the injury, and the absence of skin abrasion on the knee. The final key that made Leonard's medical file more important than ever was the timing of the bandaging. It occurred too close to the moment he reported her missing to be considered random coincidence, especially when no evidence showed he had actually searched for his wife as claimed. The clinic log also recorded that Leonard appeared tense but calm, not rushed or panicked as one would expect from someone who had just lost contact with his wife at night. From the cold case perspective, this further clarified that his injury did not fit the scenario of searching in panic, but rather matched a completely different type of confrontation, a confrontation that only this year began to be considered the missing link in the Marion Hale case. The information about Leonard's knee injury, combined with the inconsistencies in his statements, led the cold case team to take a crucial next step, obtaining a warrant to search the entire former Hale family home, now rented by others, but still containing some of the previous owner's old belongings in the backyard shed. When the search team arrived, They prioritized areas likely to have long-term storage. The small attic crawl space, the original 1940s wooden drawers, and especially the backyard shed, where many household items had been abandoned for decades. While sorting through old wooden crates, an officer discovered a small wooden box, rusted lock still intact, placed against the east wall. When the lid was opened, it contained a few worthless items: old newspaper scraps, a child's handkerchief, and a woman's pale red wool shawl, almost exactly matching the color description of the scarf found in the rock crevice in 1950. The team immediately brought the scarf for on-site examination. The scarf in the wooden box had been folded many times, indicating it had not been used in a long time, but a small amount of sand still clung to the hem. That sand was collected into evidence bags and sent to the temporary field lab set up in the backyard. When technicians screened the sand, they found it was finer than beach sand, a mixture of light beige grains, tiny coral fragments, and basalt dust. Preliminary examination, under a hand lens, showed this sand originated from the rock ledge above the natural stone stairs leading down to the sea at Diamond Head, the spot where Marion used to stand and watch the ocean but rarely descended at night. Most significantly, this sand type did not match any of the 1950 samples collected from the location where the scarf was found. The sand in that crevice was coarser, with larger coral pieces and no basalt dust. This prompted the investigators to ask a major question: was the scarf found in the rock crevice in 1950 actually the one Marion wore the night she disappeared, or was it a substitute or staged item? To eliminate confusion, the cold case team compared both scarves, the one from the wooden box and archival photos of the 1950 seized scarf, through detailed fiber analysis. The differences were clear. The 1950 scarf had coarser weave and a completely different knitting pattern from the type Marion typically wore, according to Ava's old statement. By contrast, the scarf found in the wooden box perfectly matched Marion's habits: smaller size, finer yarn, and the distinctive coral-tinged red popular in the 1950s. When the team reviewed all remaining family photos in the house, they found one taken of Marion a few months before her disappearance, wearing exactly the style of shawl now lying in the box. This raised the possibility that the scarf found in 1950 did not belong to Marion, or at least was not the one she wore when she left the house. The cold case team collected additional sand samples from the high ledge above the stairs, and the results perfectly matched the sand on the scarf in the box. That proved this scarf had been in contact with the area above the tide line, not the location where it supposedly would have been found if it drifted into the sea. This discovery created a major turning point. If Marion's real scarf was still at home and had never gone to the ocean, where did the scarf in the 1950 crevice come from? And more importantly, who placed a fake scarf there, and why create evidence of drifting? These questions came fast and forced the team to acknowledge that the 1950 disappearance was not simply a misunderstood accident. It had been deliberately steered from the start with intentionally planted evidence. The discovery of the scarf in the wooden box compelled the cold case team to move to a full synthesis of all evidence spanning nearly 6 decades to determine whether the scattered pieces in the file could be strung together into a single coherent scenario, and that process quickly revealed that everything previously regarded as disconnected now fit together in one direction. First was the physical evidence group. The 1950 crevice scarf did not match color, fiber structure, or sand composition with what Marion actually used. The metal bowl and medicine bottle were found in positions tide could never reach, and Marion's real scarf was discovered at home with high-ledge sand. All of that showed the ocean crime scene had been staged rather than the natural result of an accident. When the investigators placed this data next to the historical statements, a chain of contradictions emerged clearly. Leonard changed his story about when he realized his wife had not returned. He could not account for the period he left the house that night, and his left knee injury did not match a search-related fall, but was consistent with struggle-type trauma. The children's statements, especially Ava's, were also incorporated into the chain. They heard a brief argument inside the house before Marion said she wanted to go out for some air, and Ava insisted her mother's scarf was still in the room right after Marion walked down the stone stairs. When these two details were combined, the cold case team identified a critical inconsistency. If Marion left the house without her scarf, how could a different scarf appear in the crevice as guiding evidence? The next element in the synthesis was the tide and current modeling. NOAA's hindcast analysis showed no scenario whatsoever that could carry the evidence to the recorded positions, regardless of wind or wave conditions. Every simulation indicated the items in the crevice had to have been placed by hand. That result directly invalidated the entire drifting accident hypothesis, the very foundation on which the 1950 file was closed. A detail once dismissed, the strange light a witness saw near the stairs the night Marion disappeared, was also added to the evidence chain. When cross-referenced with 1950s electrical records, the cold case team determined no nearby house had outdoor lights aimed toward the ocean, and a light as bright as described could only come from a large flashlight or handheld device while someone worked at the scene. This matched the possibility that someone moved evidence down to the ocean area in the middle of the night before daylight could expose the staging. Next were the timeline contradictions. Leonard claimed he searched the beach area before calling police, yet no witness saw him near the water. At the same time, medical records proved he sustained the injury during the exact window he said he was searching. The investigators noticed a striking coincidence. The period Leonard was away from the house overlapped perfectly with the strange light sighting and with the feasible window for placing evidence in the crevice. Finally, when all the data was laid out on the master board, evidence in wrong positions, real scarf still at home, tide disproving drift. Contradictory statements, injury consistent with struggle, strange light consistent with staging. The cold case team saw that every piece, whether from 1950 or from 2007 analysis, pointed to the same unified scenario. That scenario was written as an investigative hypothesis. Marion did not disappear at sea, but met her fate inside her own home. An incident, argument, struggle, or act of violence occurred before she stepped out the door. The exact manner and timing are not yet confirmed, but fully align with the children's accounts of loud noises and conflict inside the house. Afterward, an adult with the ability to control the scene staged the ocean accident cover, carried evidence out to the ledge area, placed the items in calculated positions, and created the story that Marion went for a walk and slipped. Of everyone present in the house that night, only one person had motive, opportunity, matching injury, and access to all the evidence: Leonard Hale. The cold case panel unanimously recorded the hypothesis: Marion Hale died inside the house, and the entire ocean scene was constructed by Leonard to erase the real traces, causing the case to be misunderstood as a seaside accident for nearly 60 years. Once the unified hypothesis was clearly formed on the evidence board, the cold case team decided to use modern 3D virtual crime scene simulation technology, something unavailable in 1950. To answer the remaining question, was there any physically possible scenario under the actual conditions of the night Marion disappeared that would allow the evidence to reach the recorded positions naturally? They began by reconstructing a Diamond Head coastal terrain model based on archival photos, military maps, and the latest on-site measurements. The basalt walls were rebuilt with centimeter-accurate slopes. The stone stairs were modeled from laser scan data, and both the low sand beach and high rock ledge were imported into the software. The simulation team then recreated the victim falls into water scenario in 3 variants: fall from mid-stairs, fall from the bottom step, and slip from the ledge edge. Virtual sensors showed that a straight fall into the sea would follow a near-perpendicular trajectory and land in deep water 1-2 meters from the stairs without impacting the surrounding ledge. The simulation was repeated dozens of times, varying weight, fall posture, and wind, yet never placed the victim near the crevice where the evidence was found. More importantly, the software showed that any fall severe enough to cause serious injury would leave clear traces on the stairs. stone scratches, long skid marks, or at least fabric fibers caught on the rock. But comparison with 1950 archival photos showed the stairs were completely clean, with no signs of human body impact. When the team shifted to modeling the evidence movement, they recreated the motion of the scarf, metal bowl, and medicine bottle in that night's sea conditions. A scarf released from the ledge or stairs was blown westward by wind, never entering the southeast-leaning crevice. The metal bowl was too heavy for waves to push upward. Modeling showed it would sink immediately upon hitting water. The only way it could reach shore was under extreme waves combined with high wind. But historical data confirmed waves that night were average at most. When the bowl was modeled striking rock, the software recorded heavy dents and scratches on the metal surface, whereas the actual bowl showed virtually no damage, an impossible coincidence. The medicine bottle was also simulated under a fall into water scenario. With its tapered shape and small cap, any drop from more than half a meter caused it to spin, strike rock, and drift far away. 92% of runs resulted in chipped edges or a popped cap, yet the recovered bottle was completely intact. To test an extreme scenario, the team modeled a person carrying the items and accidentally dropping them while slipping, yet the outcome remained unchanged. No simulation naturally placed all three items in the exact crevice. Finally, the technicians tested the only remaining scenario: the items were carried to the crevice by human hands and placed there. When manual placement was simulated, every position recorded in the 1950 report matched real-world parameters perfectly, and the software flagged a 100% probability match, while every natural drift scenario returned 0%. Looking at the final comparison table, the cold case team had no doubt left. 3D science confirmed that out of hundreds of simulations, not a single case allowed the evidence to arrive naturally at the discovery site. Manual staging, however, matched perfectly. This reinforced the entire prior conclusion: the 1950 ocean scene was not the answer to Marion Hale's disappearance. It was a camouflage layer created to mislead the investigation. The results of the virtual 3D crime scene reconstruction, with 0% match for every natural drift scenario and 100% match for manual staging, became the final link in the chain of evidence the cold case team had collected over many months. When the full technical report was placed alongside NOAA-tied analyses, Leonard's contradictory statements, the injury inconsistent with an accident, the real scarf still at home, evidence lacking sea salt, and the 1950 rescue team's erroneous notes, the complete picture became so clear that no room remained for alternative theories. The concluding meeting was held at Honolulu PD headquarters, where investigators presented the entire evidence chain in sequence. Marion did not fall into the sea. The evidence could not appear in the crevice naturally. The ocean scene was manipulated by human hands. A struggle inside the house was the only scenario consistent with Leonard's physical signs. And the period Leonard was out of sight perfectly overlapped with the strange light under the stone stairs. When veteran officers remarked they had never seen a 1950 missing person file with such a high degree of evidentiary alignment, the task force knew they had reached the point of no return. This was no longer a verification case, but a criminal prosecution with sufficient legal grounds to proceed. The final report, over 140 pages, was completed and forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office handling unsolved cases in Hawaii. The federal prosecutor and his legal advisory team spent nearly 2 weeks reviewing every subsection, reconstructed 1950 weather data, evidence photos, statements from surviving witnesses, and the forensic analysis of Leonard's knee injury mechanism. Each part was evaluated against standards of reasonable probability and evidentiary independence. When they reached the 3D simulation section, the prosecutor paused for a long time over the probability chart. Every natural simulation line collapsed to 0%, while the manual placement line hit 100%. Combined with the discovery of Marion's real scarf at home, this became near absolute exclusionary evidence against the 1950 accident theory, a legal turning point rarely seen in a case closed for over half a century. After a closed-door meeting with assistant prosecutors, the U.S. attorney confirmed the file met the threshold to seek an arrest warrant under federal statutes for first-degree murder in cases without a body. But with evidence establishing deprivation of life and scene staging, Honolulu PD was officially notified in writing, "Sufficient legal basis exists." Those few words marked the end of a nearly 60-year investigation phase and the beginning of the next direct action, as the team shifted from analysis to preparing to execute an arrest warrant against the person they believe has concealed the truth since 1950. Immediately after receiving the confirmation document from the federal prosecutor, the Honolulu Police Department executed a meticulously planned low-profile arrest of Leonard Hale, designed to eliminate any chance of flight or destruction of remaining evidence. The morning was chosen as the time when Leonard was least on guard, when he routinely stayed home to let in his regular caregiver. The Cold Case Task Force, coordinating with the Warrant Execution Unit, approached the old wooden house in Kailua, where Leonard had lived for the past 3 decades. The team split into 2 groups. One approached the front door, the other sealed off the backyard in case he attempted to flee through a side exit. When the officers knocked and announced a federal arrest warrant, Leonard came to the door, looking surprised but not panicked, as if he had long rehearsed this exact reaction. He immediately declared that he had no idea what was going on and that Marion fell into the ocean. Everyone knows that. A denial identical to his 1950 statement, delivered so mechanically that the arresting officers instantly recognized its unnatural rigidity. Leonard was handcuffed without any resistance, but as he was led to the car, he turned and shouted that no one can prove anything, it was all an accident. The investigators did not respond. The arrest warrant had been issued on an independent, irrefutable chain of evidence. Simultaneously with the arrest, a separate HPD team executed an expanded search warrant on the entire residence to seize personal documents, diaries, notes, old medical bills, and any items potentially connected to the night Marion disappeared. In Leonard's bedroom, investigators located an old document pouch containing 1950s medical payment receipts, including a statement from the exact clinic he visited the night of the disappearance, a record missing from the original file. They also recovered a small leather-bound notebook with faded handwriting containing fragmented entries about family conflicts, financial pressure, and cryptic lines about maintaining order in the home. Although its legal value could not yet be determined at the scene, the notebook was sealed and fully cataloged for later expert review. In the backyard shed, the search team seized numerous original Hale family items that the current tenant had piled in a corner, including several personal belongings that had once been Marion's, all packaged according to procedure. Throughout the search, Leonard repeatedly insisted that everyone is wrong, that no one understood Marion like he did, and that the ocean took her, not a person. But when investigators asked him to explain the inconsistencies about the knee injury, the real scarf still in the house, or the strange light witnesses saw, Leonard fell completely silent, looked away, and did not ask for a lawyer or offer further statements. As the police car carrying Leonard pulled away from the house where he had spent most of his life after the events of 1950, the cold case team knew they had just crossed a critical threshold from a missing person file to a criminal homicide case, from suspicion to action. Leonard Hale was no longer the husband who reported his wife missing. He had officially become the prime suspect in a case buried for 57 years. In the Honolulu PD interrogation room, Leonard Hale sat across from 2 cold case detectives in the heavy atmosphere of a case buried for more than half a century, finally dragged back into the light. After repeating his denials like a broken record, Leonard was confronted with the full array of new physical evidence, the 3D reconstruction proving the beach scene was staged, Marion's real scarf found in an old wooden box, while he always insisted she was wearing it when she left. NOAA tide data, proving the items could not have drifted into the rock crevice, Ava's childhood statement about a loud crash inside the house, and Leonard's own 1950 left knee injury. Forensic experts concluded it was far more consistent with a struggle than with running to search for a missing person. Leonard tried to keep his voice calm, but each new piece of evidence caused his breathing to falter. When the detective placed photographs of the 1950 fake scarf and the fiber analysis report in front of him, Leonard leaned forward, then slumped back, his eyes flickering, a clear sign that his last psychological defenses were cracking. The breaking point came when the detective set the 3D crime scene reconstruction on the table, demonstrating how the items had been manually placed in the crevice and how every natural drift scenario failed completely. Combined with the timeline chart proving he left the house exactly when the strange light appeared below the cliff, Leonard had nowhere left to go. A long silence blanketed the room before he suddenly dropped his head, his hands clenching until the knuckles went white. When his voice finally emerged after nearly an hour of silence, it was no longer steady. It trembled and cracked, as if dragged from the deepest place he had spent decades trying to lock away. He admitted that on the night Marion disappeared, a violent argument broke out in the bedroom. Marion wanted to leave the house and take the two children to live with her mother for an extended time to breathe again, which pushed Leonard into a feeling of total loss of control and terror of abandonment. Words quickly turned to shoving when Marion tried to open the door and Leonard tried to stop her. He said that in one moment of lost temper, he grabbed her arm hard, yanked her back inside, causing her to lose balance and fall toward the wooden dresser, her head striking the corner hard. He described the impact sound as something that left normal sensation behind, and when Marion lay motionless on the floor, he panicked, checked for breath, and found none. Instead of calling for help, Leonard admitted that terror made him think only of what would happen to him and the children, and he believed that if the authorities learned the truth, his life would collapse. Within minutes, the idea formed to stage an ocean accident, an idea conceived in panic that derailed the case for nearly 60 years. When asked to describe exactly how he concealed the body, Leonard closed his eyes for a long time, then opened them, and slowly recounted. He wrapped Marion in a coarse cloth from the shed, waited until the children fell back asleep, then dragged the body down a little-used trail to the Diamond Head Cliff area. He chose the overland route instead of the stone stairs directly in front of the house to avoid being seen by neighbors. When he reached the edge of the basalt cliff, he found a narrow but deep crevice that waves never reached even at high tide. It took many minutes to maneuver Marion's body inside because the crevice was angled and required lifting her at a slant. Leonard admitted using his left leg to brace against the rock edge while twisting his knee, and causing the injury, matching both the medical expert conclusion and the 1950 clinic record. He also described wrapping a woven mat around Marion's torso to prevent leaving traces on the sharp basalt while sliding her into the narrow space. After hiding the body, he collected 3 items: a metal bowl, a medicine bottle, and a scarf that was not Marion's but looked plausible, and placed them in a lower crevice to simulate a drift path. The strange light witnesses saw was, he confirmed, from the large flashlight he used to find his way out, because it was pitch black. Leonard said he then returned home, let some time pass, woke the children, and called police, trying to create the impression he had only just discovered Marion was missing. When asked why he stayed silent for all these years, Leonard answered briefly, I lived with the fear I created myself, it never went away. And when the detectives asked him to pinpoint the exact crevice where he hid the body, he no longer hesitated. For the first time in 57 years, Leonard Hale agreed to lead police to the place where he had buried the truth about the night Marion disappeared. The morning after Leonard's guided confession, a joint Honolulu PD Special Task Force, Forensic Unit, and professional climbing team accessed the basalt cliff area east of Diamond Head, at the spot Leonard described as a narrow crevice higher than the tide, unnoticed by anyone. A location modern geological maps marked only as dangerously inaccessible terrain. Officers had to use safety ropes, anchors, and rock climbing gear to reach the crevice edge, something that in 1950, with primitive equipment, would have been nearly impossible. When one investigator shone a light deep inside, The beam reflected off unnaturally stacked ivory-white objects against the basalt walls. After widening the approach, the forensic team confirmed they were human bones wedged in the gap between two basalt slabs that had remained fixed for decades, completely untouched by seawater. The entire area was immediately sealed, and the forensic team began a meticulous recovery, photographing, numbering, and collecting each bone fragment under international standards. When the skull was extracted, the forensic specialist noted a clear depression on the right frontal area, a classic depressed fracture from high-force impact with a hard-edged object, remarkably consistent with Leonard's description of Marion falling against the dresser corner. The left cheekbone also showed a small chip, indicating asymmetrical force, further supporting that the victim lost balance and fell sideways rather than being struck by waves or secondary impact underwater. The arm and leg bones showed no drag marks on sharp rock or collision damage from a marine environment, proving the body never contacted the ocean after death. Once the full skeleton was recovered, anthropologists began analysis. Based on femur, tibia, and humerus proportions, they estimated the victim's height at 5'3", 5'4", 1.60, 1.62 m, exactly matching Marion Hale's recorded height in 1950. The pelvis confirmed female sex, age 28, 35, matching Marion's age at disappearance. Within hours, the team ruled out every other missing person case in the area, because the anthropological profile matched Marion's almost perfectly. The forensic team then assessed time since death markers, mineralization level, natural bone wear, and the absolutely dry conditions inside the basalt crevice indicated the remains had lain there for decades, approximately 57 years since Marion vanished. This aligned perfectly with Leonard's confession, further corroborating its authenticity. In the lab, the skull underwent micro-CT analysis, revealing a wide V-shaped fracture on the forehead, characteristic of impact with a hard-edged object, not the rounded surface of waves or sea-worn rock. Radiating fracture lines in a star pattern indicated the force occurred while the victim was still alive or still had circulating blood. A critical forensic detail proving the injury was sufficient to cause unconsciousness or death before any environmental exposure. This completely eliminated the possibility that the victim fell into the ocean and was later battered against rocks by waves, which would have left rounded abrasions or water motion scratches. No marine organism traces, salt infiltration, or water damage were present in the bone. Proof the body never entered the ocean during decomposition, meaning the victim never fell into the sea as the original 1950 theory claimed. Notably, the team also recovered microscopic brown-gray fabric fibers on several upper ribs, identified as coarse cloth identical to the material Leonard said he used to wrap the body. Fiber comparison with cloth from the shed search produced a match, completing an unbroken chain from confession to physical evidence. The team then evaluate mechanical trace evaluation on limb bones for defensive injuries. Preliminary findings showed no defensive fractures, consistent with Marion losing consciousness rapidly after the dresser impact rather than a prolonged assault. All independent scientific conclusions pointed to one finding: Marion died from blunt force head trauma inside the home. The body was hidden that same night, and the ocean fall was a secondary staged scene to conceal the truth. For absolute certainty, DNA analysis was performed on remaining marrow from the femur and humerus, compared to a sample from the now-adult Ava. The match was 99.999%, eliminating any possibility of misidentification. Once the full forensic report was completed, hundreds of pages long, it emphasized, no ocean accident mechanism can explain the injuries and body location. All evidence confirms death by direct blunt force to the head, occurring on land. With the recovery of the remains, the skull fracture, matching fabric traces, and total exclusion of marine factors, the decades-long investigation finally had a clear, objective, indisputable scientific answer. Marion Hale's disappearance was not a mystery of the Hawaiian Night Sea in 1950, but a death concealed inside the home where she lived, cleverly disguised by a staged scene at the foot of Diamond Head. The discovery of the body and the modern forensic report brought the Marion Hale case to its final stage, criminal prosecution. The trial began in early fall 2007 at the federal court in Honolulu, where prosecutors presented to the jury a chain of evidence stretching from 1950 to 2007, an almost six-decade timeline that highlighted advances in forensic science and the unrelenting persistence of investigators who inherited a case once consigned to the cold case archives. Prosecutors opened by reconstructing the entire night Marion vanished. The children's statements about arguing, the sudden disappearance with no witnesses, the implausible placement of evidence in an area tides could not reach, and Leonard's contradictions about timeline behavior and time away from the house. Each piece was laid out as links in a single chain, from Marion's real scarf found at home to the fake one planted in the crevice, from NOAA tide simulations, proving items could not drift naturally, to 3D reconstructions, confirming manual staging. Prosecutors presented anthropological evidence identifying the basalt crevice skeleton as Marion Hale, with DNA matching Ava's sample almost perfectly. They then moved to the critical issue: cause of death. The forensic report detailed the V-shaped frontal fracture, antemortem skull trauma, absence of seawater traces, and no rounded abrasions or marine impact marks on bones, all confirming Marion died inside the house and was later placed in the crevice. Prosecutors continued with circumstantial evidence, the witness's strange light matching the exact time Leonard left the house. 1950 medical records of a left knee injury consistent with bracing and twisting while dragging a heavy object into a tight space, matching Leonard's confession, and the misplaced items, metal bowl, medicine bottle, fake scarf, all microscopically proven untouched by seawater. After reconstructing the entire crime scene and evidence chain, prosecutors presented the centerpiece, Leonard's own 2007 interrogation confession, admitting the fight, admitting hiding the body, admitting staging the ocean scene. The recorded confession was played, though Leonard had retracted it weeks before trial, claiming psychological coercion. Prosecutors swiftly countered by showing how details in his confession matched the bone evidence exactly, details he could not have fabricated or guessed without first-hand experience. Leonard's defense attorney argued that Marion's death was an accident during an uncontrollable argument, that Leonard had no intent to kill and only concealed the body out of panic. They stressed she might have fallen during mutual shoving, not an attack, and that Leonard lacked the sophistication to stage a scene that looked logical in 1950 eyes. Prosecutors demolished this using the science. If it was an accident and Leonard truly panicked, why not call for help? Why drag the body hundreds of yards to a treacherous crevice? Why plant fake evidence and stage a drift path? And above all, why maintain the ocean fall story for 57 years? The jury listened for 3 weeks, as every witness, forensic expert, and cold case detective was called. Tension peaked during the scientific cross-examination phase. The 3D simulation was projected in court, showing drift paths were physically impossible, and photos of the crevice containing Marion's remains silenced the courtroom. When defense counsel argued, "No one knows for sure whether the fall in the house caused instant death," prosecutors replied that the issue was not the fall itself, but the subsequent conduct: concealing the body, staging the scene, and filing a false report, acts that fully constitute the charged crimes under Hawaii and federal law. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreperson stood and delivered the verdict clearly. Leonard Hale was guilty of second-degree murder, killing caused intentionally, not impulsively, followed by deliberate concealment of the consequences. The jury also found him guilty of tampering with evidence for staging the scene and planting items, and false reporting for deliberately misleading authorities for decades. As the verdict was read, Leonard sat motionless, no reaction, eyes fixed on the table, as if he had already accepted his fate, while in the courtroom, those who had followed the case from the beginning could barely breathe as the truth was finally named. At sentencing, the judge emphasized the gravity, not only causing a wife's death, but forcing 2 children to grow up motherless while living with a lie their entire lives. He highlighted that keeping the secret and staging the scene stalled the case for nearly 60 years, one of the longest delays in Hawaii judicial history. Ultimately, the court sentenced Leonard Hale to 25 years imprisonment, aggregating all counts, and stated in the judgment, the sentence reflects the severity of decades-long concealment and serves as deterrence against similar conduct. When the clerk closed the file, the Marion Hale case was officially reclassified, cold case resolved, body recovered, ending one of the oldest mysteries at the foot of Diamond Head and closing the journey from the flawed 1950 investigation to justice, served in 2007, a long road where forgotten pieces finally found their rightful place. In the story of the Marion Hale case in Hawaii, what haunts is not just the death, but the 57 years of silence around it. Leonard did not call for help when Marion fell and struck her head. He dragged her body to a basalt crevice at Diamond Head, staged an ocean accident, planted a bowl, medicine bottle, and fake scarf, then lied to police. The 2 children grew up believing an accident story, while the truth lay buried in stone. In today's United States, where domestic violence and safety at home remain urgent issues, this case stands as a warning. Ava's childhood memory of the loud crash and her mother's scarf still in the room until the cold case team returned reminds us that children's voices matter. If adults in 1950 had taken that testimony more seriously, if a culture of believing victims and support hotlines had existed, the truth might not have stayed buried so long. The story asks, in our own neighborhoods, in our own families, is there something not right that we deliberately avoid looking at because we fear the truth? The modern evidence chain, NOAA-tied modeling, 3D reconstruction, bone analysis, and DNA matching with Ava shows justice only advances when society dares to reopen old files to correct past mistakes. The lesson: never dismiss unusual signs, never hesitate to call police, victim services, or a hotline when something feels wrong. Silence in the name of respecting privacy can sometimes be a form of complicity. Thank you for following the journey that closed one of Hawaii's oldest cold cases. If you want to keep exploring cases solved through science and persistence like this one, please remember to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video, where we continue opening doors to the past, so the truth is never buried again.